The Terran Military Academy stood like a sentinel on the horizon, its spires towering into the heavens, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched over the rolling plains of Earth. The Academy, with its weathered stone walls and ironclad gates, had been the heart of Terran military tradition for millennia. Set in the ruins of what was once called the Pyrenees Mountains, it rose above a landscape scarred by time and war. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and steel, and the fading light of the sun bathed everything in a deep, warm gold, transitioning to crimson as dusk began its slow crawl across the sky. For John Steele, standing amidst the ranks of his fellow cadets, the Academy was more than a prestigious institution. It was the crucible that had forged him, molded him, and broken him countless times before finally allowing him to stand here, triumphant. He had spent years on this sacred ground, where the ghosts of warriors past seemed to walk beside them, reminding every cadet of the weight they carried, the legacy they were bound to uphold. Earth, scarred yet resilient, was not just his home but the birthplace of humanity's dominion over the stars. And the Academy was the cradle of that power. John stood at rigid attention, his body immovable despite the emotional storm inside him. His back was straight, his eyes fixed ahead, yet he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an iron fist. Rows upon rows of cadets, clad in their immaculate uniforms, stood alongside him on the grand parade ground. The sheer magnitude of the moment was overwhelming. Each of them had endured years of relentless training, pushing themselves to the very edge of human endurance, but today was different. Today, they stood not as cadets but as soldiers, warriors forged in the fires of the Academy, ready to serve the Terran Dominion. The sprawling parade ground seemed to extend endlessly in all directions. It was lined by ancient statues of long-dead heroes, their stone faces frozen in expressions of stoic defiance. Above them, the Academy's towering structure seemed to glow in the last rays of the sun, its Gothic spires piercing the heavens, as if to challenge the very gods themselves. Every inch of this place was steeped in history, a monument to the struggles and triumphs of the Terran Dominion. Earth might have been battered and bruised by centuries of war, its surface reshaped by terraforming, but it remained the heart of the Empire, the cradle from which humanity had spread across the stars. John's eyes flickered briefly to the distant mountains, now shrouded in twilight. Once, they had been the mighty Pyrenees, a natural fortress in Earth's distant past. Now, they served as silent witnesses to the training of the Dominion's future protectors. But the Academy wasn't just about tradition. It was about survival. His chest swelled with a mix of pride and humility. He wasn't like the others, at least, not anymore. John had achieved something only a rare few in the Academy's long history could claim. He had graduated at the very top of his class, earning the highest honors the Academy could bestow. But that accolade, though prestigious, paled in comparison to what it meant. He had earned a place in the Praetorian Guard. The Emperor's elite. The guardians of humanity's last hope. The Praetorian Guard was a legend, its members whispered about in the hallowed halls of the Academy like gods among men. They were the finest soldiers in the entire galaxy, chosen not just for their strength and skill, but for their loyalty, their unbreakable will, and their devotion to the Emperor and the Dominion. They were more than soldiers. They were protectors of the throne itself, sworn to defend the Emperor against any threat, alien or human. As the last echoes of the ceremonial march faded into the evening air, John allowed his mind to drift back over the years of grueling training that had brought him here. The sleepless nights spent memorizing tactics and strategies, the endless drills that pushed his body past its breaking point, the moments of doubt that had gnawed at him when he feared he might not be strong enough. The Academy was a place designed to break those who were unworthy, to weed out the weak, the complacent. And it had tried to break him more than once. But he had endured. His instructors had pushed him harder than the others, recognizing the potential within him even when John couldn't see it himself. They had forged him in fire, leaving no room for doubt, no room for weakness. And as he stood here now, with the future stretching out before him like a vast, uncharted starfield, John knew it had all been worth it. Every challenge, every failure, every scar, physical and mental, had been necessary. The Academy had been his battlefield, and he had emerged victorious. Cadet Steele. The voice of General Carrick rang out, sharp and commanding. John snapped back to reality, his heart pounding in his chest as the imposing figure of the general approached. Carrick was a legend in his own right, a man whose name was synonymous with victory in campaigns that had spanned the stars. His face was hardened by years of warfare, his eyes sharp as a blade as they regarded John with cold scrutiny. The general carried with him a ceremonial blade, its polished surface gleaming in the dying light. "Step forward," Carrick ordered, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. John's boots echoed on the stone ground as he moved, each step heavy with the weight of his new responsibility. Every eye in the parade ground was on him, but he felt strangely calm. This was his moment. As he reached the general, he dropped to one knee, bowing his head in deference. The centuries-old tradition of knighthood and service still lingered within the Dominion, passed down from Earth's ancient past. "By the power vested in me by the Emperor of the Terran Dominion, I hereby name you Praetorian, defender of the throne, protector of the Emperor, and guardian of our people," General Carrick said, his voice reverberating across the field. He placed the blade in John's outstretched hands, and in that moment, John felt the gravity of his new position settle over him like a mantle. The Praetorian blade was more than a weapon, it was a symbol. A symbol of everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. Rising to his feet, John looked up toward the distant stars now beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. From here, standing on the soil of Earth, he could see them more clearly than ever before. Each star represented a world within the Dominion, each a place where his duty might one day call him. Yet the weight of his true responsibility lay on Earth, here in the capital, where the Emperor ruled. John Steele, Praetorian, stood ready to face whatever the future held. The path before him was uncertain, filled with unknowns and dangers lurking in the depths of space. But as the gleaming spires of the Academy reflected the last light of the sun, John felt no fear. This was his destiny. And he would not fail. Next day the dawn broke over the Academy with a quiet, somber glow. Thin tendrils of mist curled around the stone walls and statues, making the ancient spires look ghostly in the early light. It was John Steele's final morning at the Terran Military Academy, and the realization hit him harder than he had anticipated. The place that had been his home for so many years, that had forged him into a warrior, was now just a memory in the rear view of his life. John stood on the steps of the Academy's grand entrance, the cold, damp air biting at his skin. His military-issued duffel bag rested at his feet, packed with everything he would need as he left for his new post. The world stretched out before him, vast and unknowable. He had always known this day would come, the day he would leave behind the Academy and step into the real world as a soldier of the Terran Dominion. But now that it was here, there was an odd sense of finality to it. The Academy was no longer his battlefield, the real battles lay ahead. The transport ship that would take him to his new destination hovered in the distance, sleek and angular, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. Beyond it, John could make out the faint outline of the horizon. Somewhere far to the south, across the scarred and ancient face of Earth, lay the capital city of the Dominion, Nova Lux, in the heart of what had once been called Africa. Nova Lux was a city unlike any other on Earth. Built atop the ruins of old civilizations, it was a towering metropolis of steel and glass, its sprawling structures rising from the red sands of the African continent like monoliths of a new era. It served not only as the political seat of the Dominion but also as the military nerve center of the galaxy. For John, it was more than just a city. It was the place where he would officially take up his new post as a member of the Praetorian Guard. Praetorian, John muttered to himself, still trying to wrap his mind around the title. Even after the ceremony, after General Carrick had placed the ceremonial blade in his hand and spoken the words that would change his life, the reality of it had yet to fully sink in. He was no longer just a cadet, no longer simply John Steele. He was a Praetorian, a soldier sworn to protect the Emperor himself. The weight of that responsibility had begun to settle over him like a heavy cloak. As he stood there, staring out at the landscape he would soon leave behind, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look like a man ready for battle." John turned to see Lieutenant Kara Voss, one of his closest friends at the Academy, standing a few steps behind him. Her dark hair was tied back, her uniform sharp and pristine, but there was a familiar smile on her lips. They had gone through training together, pushing each other through some of the Academy's most grueling trials. She had been one of the few people who had kept him sane in those sleepless nights of preparation. "Kara," John said, smiling as he reached down to pick up his duffel. "I didn't think you'd be up this early. You think I'd let you leave without saying goodbye?" She stepped forward and offered a mock salute. "Praetorian steel." John chuckled, shaking his head. "Still getting used to that." "You'll get used to it," Kara said. "Besides, you've earned it. Nova Lux is going to be something else. You've seen the reports, right? That city makes even the Academy look small." John nodded. He had pored over every briefing he could find about Nova Lux. The city was a marvel of engineering, a testament to humanity's mastery over Earth. Rising out of the vast Sahara Desert, it was a city of gleaming towers and shimmering domes, its skyline stretching far beyond the limits of what the old world had ever imagined. But it wasn't just the city's size that intrigued him, it was the role he was about to play in it. "I heard the Emperor himself will be there when you arrive," Kara said, her tone shifting to something more serious. John swallowed, the enormity of the statement washing over him. The Emperor, ruler of the entire Terran Dominion, commander of humanity's vast empire, would be waiting for him in Nova Lux. And John, as a member of the Praetorian Guard, would be standing by his side, sworn to protect him from any threat. "I guess so," John replied, though his voice lacked the confidence he usually projected. Kara saw through it, of course. She always did. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You'll be fine, John. You've trained for this your whole life. If anyone can handle this, it's you." John nodded, though the words felt hollow. How could anyone truly be ready for what awaited him in Nova Lux? The city was a political and military powder keg, with rival factions vying for influence and shadowy forces threatening the Emperor's rule. The Praetorian Guard was more than just a ceremonial unit, it was the last line of defense for the Emperor's life. A rumble sounded as the transport ship lowered its ramp, signaling the time for boarding. John and Kara exchanged one last look, the weight of their unspoken thoughts heavy in the air. "I guess this is it," John said quietly. Kara gave him a grin, through her eyes reflected the emotion she was trying to hide. "For now, maybe. But who knows? We might end up on the same battlefield again." "I hope so," John replied, gripping her forearm in a warrior's handshake. With one last glance at the academy that had shaped him, John slung his duffel over his shoulder and made his way toward the waiting transport. The engines hummed with quiet power as he ascended the ramp, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where his life was no longer his own but dedicated to the service of the Emperor and the survival of the Dominion. The transport lifted off the ground with a low, steady rumble, carrying John up into the sky. As he looked out the window, the academy grew smaller and smaller beneath him, fading into the patchwork of Earth's ancient terrain. Soon, the mountains and plains would give way to the vast deserts of the African continent, and there, on the shores of what was once the Nile River, Nova Lux would rise out of the sands like a fortress. As the transport broke through the last of the clouds, the landscape shifted. The rolling plains of Europe gave way to the parched, ochre-colored deserts of the Sahara. The change was drastic and immediate, a testament to how far humanity had come and how far it had yet to go. For centuries, Africa had been the birthplace of civilizations, and now, it was the heart of the Dominion itself. John's thoughts raced as they approached the capital. He had heard stories about Nova Lux for as long as he could remember, about its towering skyscrapers, its bustling markets, and its labyrinthine streets where politics and power intertwined. The city was more than just the Emperor's seat, it was the nerve center of the entire Dominion. From here, the Emperor ruled over hundreds of star systems, making decisions that would shape the future of humanity. But beneath the surface, danger lurked. Rebel factions, alien insurgents, and traitors within the Dominion all sought to undermine the Emperor's authority. John knew that his new life as a Praetorian would be filled with challenges, some he couldn't even begin to imagine. As the transport descended toward the gleaming spires of Nova Lux, John caught his first glimpse of the capital. The city sprawled across the horizon like a jewel set in the red sands of the Sahara. Towering skyscrapers reached into the sky, their glass facades reflecting the golden light of the desert sun. Hovercraft buzzed through the air, weaving between the colossal structures like insects around a hive. The Emperor's Palace, a gleaming citadel of white stone and glass, rose above the city's skyline, its spires reaching higher than any other building. It was both a symbol of the Emperor's power and a reminder of the weight of John's new responsibilities. As the transport settled onto the landing platform, John took a deep breath. The doors slid open with a hiss, and the warm, dry air of the desert capital hit him. He stepped out onto the platform, the enormity of the city spreading out before him. This was Nova Lux, the heart of the Terran Dominion. And this was his new life. Chapter 2: Orders and Ambush. The transport ship hummed as it lowered its ramp onto the landing platform, the warm African air of Nova Lux filtering into the cabin. John Steele adjusted the duffel slung over his shoulder, his boots clanging against the metal as he stepped into the heart of the Dominion's capital. The city unfolded before him, stretching out like a sea of glass and steel. Towering skyscrapers rose from the desert sands, reflecting the harsh sun off their surfaces, their tops nearly vanishing into the sky. From this vantage point, John could see the sprawling metropolis in all its glory, a breathtaking sight that filled him with awe and a sense of trepidation. Nova Lux was no ordinary city. It was a monument to human achievement, a gleaming jewel set upon the vast continent of Africa, a symbol of power and progress. Built on the remains of ancient civilizations, it now served as the political and military heart of the Terran Dominion, the place from which the Emperor himself ruled over a galaxy-spanning empire. Yet beneath its stunning facade, John knew the city hid secrets, whispers of rebellion, intrigue, and betrayal. It was a city that never slept, where shadows moved behind the scenes, and loyalty could shift like the desert sands. As John took his first steps into Nova Lux, he could feel the eyes of the city on him. Military personnel in sharp uniforms moved briskly through the streets, civilians bustled about their business, and above him, hovercrafts flitted between the towering skyscrapers like insects, their soft hum a constant backdrop to the capital's never-ending activity. The contrast between the stark, disciplined life of the academy and the frenetic energy of the capital was stark, and John felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. This was the real world, no more training simulations, no more sparring sessions. The stakes were higher now. He was no longer a cadet, he was a Praetorian, an elite soldier of the Emperor's personal guard, and his life was no longer his own. As John scanned the platform, he spotted a figure approaching him, cutting through the crowd with purpose. The man's uniform was pristine, his stride confident and commanding. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a hard, angular face framed by a dark, neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were sharp, like a predator's, scanning the crowd with a sense of controlled authority. There was something about him that immediately commanded respect, a man who had seen battle, who knew the weight of command. Praetorian steel? The man's voice was clipped, efficient. John snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Igor Vass, he introduced himself, extending a hand. His grip was firm, almost crushing. "You'll be reporting to me, at least for the moment." John released the handshake and offered a crisp salute, feeling the weight of the lieutenant's gaze sizing him up. Vass wasn't the type to waste time on pleasantries. John could see that in the way his eyes never lingered, constantly assessing, always alert. "Welcome to Nova Lux, Praetorian." "You'll find it's not as calm as it looks," Vass said, his voice carrying a hint of something John couldn't quite place, amusement. "Caution? You're being reassigned." John raised an eyebrow. He had only just set foot in the capital, and already his plans were shifting. "Reassigned? To what?" "Report to the diplomatic corps," Vass continued without hesitation, his words as precise as his movements. "Your new orders are to guard the ambassadors and key political figures of the Dominion. Diplomatic protection detail. High-profile targets. That means you're going to be in the thick of things, Praetorian." The mention of guarding diplomats caught John off guard. He had expected to be stationed closer to the Emperor, or perhaps on the front lines. But protecting ambassadors was no simple assignment, especially not in Nova Lux, where politics were as dangerous as any battlefield. He knew that much from the rumors that had filtered through the Academy. The diplomats of the Terran Dominion walked a tightrope of negotiations, balancing the needs of hundreds of worlds. And where there was politics, there was danger. Understood, John replied, keeping his voice steady, though inside he was already recalibrating. This was going to be a different kind of challenge. The diplomatic corps is a few kilometers south of here, Vass said, gesturing in the direction of the towering government buildings on the horizon. You'll report there first thing tomorrow morning. Settle in with your unit for the night. Get your bearings. You'll need them. John nodded. Anything else I should know, sir? Vass paused, narrowing his eyes. Just this, in Nova Lux, nothing is as it seems. Keep your eyes open and trust no one. Before John could respond, Vass turned sharply on his heel and disappeared into the throngs of people moving through the platform. John stood there for a moment, absorbing the cryptic warning. Trust no one. It was a reminder that rang loudly in his mind as he made his way through the garrison, a massive, fortress-like complex that sprawled across the southern edge of the capital. Soldiers and officers moved in coordinated rhythm, but there was an edge to everything, an unspoken tension that hung in the air. It was a city of power, yes, but also of danger. John's quarters were sparse, almost identical to the ones he had left behind at the Academy, though they lacked the cold, rigid structure of that place. As night fell, the distant glow of the city lit up the sky outside his window, casting long shadows across the room. John stood by the window for a long time, gazing out at the city skyline. The towering structures of Nova Lux sparkled like jewels in the night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that behind that dazzling exterior, something darker lurked. His thoughts drifted to the next day's assignment. The diplomatic corps. Ambassadors. Key figures in the Dominion's vast political machine. It wasn't what he had expected, but it was important, perhaps even more important than standing at the Emperor's side. Politics shaped the future of humanity, and now John would be standing guard at the center of it all. John tried to sleep, but his rest was uneasy, filled with fragmented dreams of faces he hadn't met, shadows shifting in the corners of his mind. He woke before dawn, his heart still racing from the remnants of a half-remembered nightmare. The air was cool and dry, but he could already feel the heat of the coming day creeping into the room. It was early, but John decided he needed to see more of the city before reporting for duty. He dressed quickly, donning his black Praetorian uniform, the sleek material feeling like a second skin. Instead of taking the hovercrafts available, John opted to walk. Nova Lux was a city meant to be experienced on foot, its narrow alleys and broad avenues telling stories that couldn't be seen from the air. As he left the garrison, he made his way through the still-waking streets of the capital. Vendors were beginning to set up their stalls, and workers were already bustling toward their jobs, but the crowds were still thin in the early light. The massive skyscrapers towered above him, casting long shadows over the streets below. John moved with purpose, but as he walked, he allowed himself to take in the sights and sounds of the capital. The streets were a mix of old and new, remnants of ancient buildings from a time before the Dominion stood side by side with sleek, modern structures. It was a reminder of how far humanity had come, and yet how much it still held onto the past. Halfway to the diplomatic corps, John's senses tingled with a sudden unease. The street had grown quieter, the foot traffic thinning out as he moved through one of the narrower alleyways. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the area behind him. Nothing. Just the distant hum of hovercrafts and the faint sounds of the waking city. But something wasn't right. John picked up his pace slightly, his instincts on high alert. He had barely made it a few more steps when everything went dark. A rough cloth was thrown over his head, plunging him into immediate blindness. His first instinct was to reach for his weapon, but before his hand could even brush the hilt of his blade, strong arms wrapped around him, immobilizing him with a practiced precision. John struggled, muscles straining as he tried to break free, but whoever had grabbed him was skilled, and they had the element of surprise. He could hear hurried footsteps around him, voices speaking in rapid, hushed tones. Panic surged through his veins as he thrashed against his captors, but it was no use. His arms were pinned to his sides, his legs kicked out from under him, and then he felt himself being lifted off the ground. "Get him in," a voice barked, harsh and commanding, though muffled by the bag over John's head. John's heart raced as he heard the unmistakable whine of a ship's engines descending from above. The air around him grew hotter, dust swirling as the ship's landing gear thudded against the ground nearby. His head spun in the darkness as he was dragged across the street, his boots scraping against the ground. A hatch hissed open, and John was thrown into the hold of the ship. His body hit the cold, metallic floor with a dull thud, the wind knocked out of him. He tried to rise, but heavy boots pressed down on his back, pinning him in place. More footsteps, more hurried voices. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but he could hear the urgency in their tones. The hatch slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the engines roared to life. The ship lifted off the ground, and John felt his stomach drop as they ascended rapidly. Blind, immobilized, and helpless, John lay on the floor of the ship, his mind racing. Who had taken him? Where were they taking him? And most importantly, why? John's world was still enveloped in darkness. The rough fabric of the bag over his head scratched at his skin as he lay on the cold, metallic floor of the ship. He had long since lost any sense of time, his mind swirling in a haze of confusion and fear. The muffled hum of the ship's engines vibrated through his body, a constant reminder of his helplessness. Bound and blinded, John could do nothing but listen to the steady thrum of the ship and the occasional murmur of voices around him. His arms ached from being restrained for so long, and every shift of his body brought a new wave of discomfort. He tried to control his breathing, focusing on the rhythm of the engines, attempting to calm the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He didn't know who had taken him, or why, but he knew one thing: he was a Praetorian, and no matter what they planned for him, he wouldn't break easily. Suddenly, the ship jolted. John's stomach lurched as he felt the ship descend, the engine shifting to a lower, grumbling pitch. The vessel shuddered slightly as it touched down. His heart raced, every muscle tensing as the realization dawned: wherever they were, they had arrived. The ship's hatch opened with a hiss, and he heard the scrape of boots against the floor, the sound of his captors moving quickly. Rough hands grabbed him again, dragging him to his feet. John's legs felt weak, stiff from being bound for so long, but the men holding him were relentless. They shoved him forward, the bag still over his head, blinding him to his surroundings. His boots clanged against the metal floor as they led him down the ship's ramp, the air around him changing from the cold, stale confines of the ship to something warmer, heavier. He could feel the humidity on his skin and smell the faint scent of earth and dust in the air. They were outside now. He stumbled as he was pushed forward, but his captors didn't relent. They guided him across the uneven ground, their footsteps steady and purposeful, while John tried to focus on the few clues he could gather. The ground felt firm under his feet, packed dirt, and he could hear the distant rustle of leaves. A forest, perhaps? Or maybe an old estate. John didn't have time to wonder. The echo of footsteps changed suddenly, shifting from the muffled sound of dirt to the sharper, hollow tap of boots on stone. He was being led indoors, through what felt like a house or a building of some sort. The air was cooler now, the sounds of the outside world fading away as they moved through space. The echo of his captor's boots grew louder, bouncing off the walls as they marched him down a long corridor. The acoustics told him the hallway was narrow, with high ceilings. His senses strained in the darkness, every little detail imprinting itself in his mind: the sharp scent of wood polish, the soft creak of a door somewhere in the distance, the faint drip of water. He could feel the weight of the place, its silence oppressive, as if it had been abandoned for years, but was now seeing life again, though for a far more sinister purpose. They finally stopped. John's heart pounded as he felt himself shoved roughly into a chair. The cold metal dug into his back as they forced him down, tying his wrists and ankles with practiced efficiency. He struggled, but it was no use, the ropes were tight, cutting into his skin as he tried to flex his muscles. He couldn't move, couldn't see, couldn't do anything but sit there, helpless in the darkness. The silence hung heavy in the room, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. John tried to focus, to steady himself, but then, crack! A sudden, brutal punch slammed into the side of his face, snapping his head to the side. Pain exploded in his jaw, radiating through his skull. The world seemed to spin as he gasped for breath, the shock of the hit disorienting him. Before he could recover, a voice pierced through the darkness. A woman's voice. Cold, calculating, and detached. "What unit are you from, and what is your name?" John clenched his jaw, saying nothing. His training had prepared him for this. He had been taught to withstand interrogation, to endure whatever pain was inflicted upon him without breaking. He wouldn't give them anything. There was a pause. Then, another crack. A second punch landed, this one harder than the first, driving the air from his lungs. John slumped to the side, groaning through gritted teeth as he fought to stay upright. His head pounded, but still, he refused to answer. The woman's voice came again, calm and steady, as if the violence meant nothing to her. "What unit are you from, and what is your name?" John's lips stayed pressed together, his mind swimming in a sea of pain. He wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't betray the Praetorians, no matter what they did to him. He had endured worse in the academy, he told himself. He could endure this. The voice sighed, a soft, almost mocking sound. "No problem," she said. "When I'm done with you, you'll be telling me what you ate last year." The torture began in earnest. The punches came fast and hard, each one more brutal than the last. John felt his body jerk and convulse with every blow, but still, he remained silent. The woman's voice would ask the same question after each round of pain, her tone eerily calm, almost clinical. "What unit are you from? What is your name?" John said nothing. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his body shaking with the effort to hold on. He lost track of time. The minutes, the hours, they all blurred together in a haze of agony. Every time he thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The first day was a blur of fists, kicks, and taunts. His captors worked methodically, targeting his ribs, his face, and his legs, always careful to inflict pain without causing too much permanent damage. They wanted to break him, but they wanted him conscious. They wanted answers. But John didn't break. The second day brought new methods of torment. They tied his wrists behind him, stretching his arms until his shoulders screamed with pain. They poured cold water over his head, letting it drip into his ears and mouth, choking him as they continued to demand his unit and name. John's world was reduced to a series of sharp, jagged moments, each one filled with pain, each one a test of his endurance. By the third day, John's body was barely functioning. His face was swollen, his ribs bruised and likely fractured, his skin covered in cuts and welts. His throat was raw from gasping for air, and his vision swam in and out of focus. He had lost all sense of where he was, who his captors were, or how much longer he could hold on. Still, the questions kept coming. "What unit are you from? What is your name?" John's lips were cracked, his voice barely more than a whisper. His thoughts were slipping, his mind drifting into darkness. He was trained for this, yes, but even the most well-prepared soldier had limits. He felt another punch land squarely on his ribs, and the pain was so sharp it stole his breath. His vision went white, and for a moment, everything stopped. His body convulsed, every muscle spasming with agony. John's head slumped forward, his breathing shallow. He couldn't resist anymore. His mind was breaking, his will crumbling under the unrelenting pain. He knew he was fading. He could feel the blackness creeping in at the edges of his vision, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could hold on. He felt his consciousness slipping away, the world turning to darkness. As the woman's voice echoed one last time in his ears, John lost himself to the void. Chapter 3. Awakenings and Shadows. John drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind lost in a fog of pain and confusion. His body felt weightless, suspended in a strange, liquid warmth. He tried to open his eyes, but they felt heavy, as though the world itself was pressing down on him, forcing him to stay trapped in the darkness. Slowly, shapes and lights began to filter in through his blurred vision, faint outlines dancing on the edge of his awareness. His senses gradually sharpened, and the pain hit him like a wave. It wasn't the sharp agony he remembered from the interrogation, but a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to resonate through every part of his body. He could feel the tightness in his muscles, the bruises on his skin, and the relentless pounding in his head. John forced his eyes open fully, and the world around him began to take shape. He was floating in a glass tube, surrounded by a strange, bluish liquid. Wires and tubes were attached to his body, connected to various machines that hummed softly in the background. The liquid was warm and comforting, somehow dulling the intensity of his pain, but his mind still reeled with disorientation. Where am I? What happened? John turned his head to the right, and through the faint distortion of the glass, he saw someone sitting just outside the tube. His heart jumped in recognition. It was Lieutenant Igor Vass, the same man who had given him orders at the station in Nova Lux. The last time John had seen him, Vass had been a figure of calm authority. Now, he sat in a chair beside John's regeneration tube, leaning forward with a curious expression. Seeing John's eyes flutter open, Vass smiled. "Well, it's about time," Vass said, his voice carrying that same steady authority. "It's good that you woke up, John. You've been asleep for 3 days." John tried to respond, but his throat was dry, and the words caught in his mouth. His body still felt too weak to move. Panic began to set in. He had so many questions. 3 days? What happened to him? What had they done? Before he could muster any strength to speak, Vass raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "Relax," he said, his tone calming but firm. "There's no need to say anything right now. You're safe. You've been through a lot, but you'll understand everything soon enough." The lieutenant rose from his chair, his boots tapping softly on the floor. He moved with the same precision John remembered from their first meeting, the same efficient confidence. He gave John a final glance, his expression unreadable, before heading for the door. "Rest now," Vass said as he reached the exit. "We'll talk later." With that, the door slid shut behind him, leaving John alone in the softly lit room. The liquid in the glass tube bubbled gently around him, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the medical equipment monitoring his vitals. John blinked, trying to process what had just happened. His mind raced with questions, but there were no answers, just the strange, sterile environment around him. He glanced around as much as his weakened state allowed, noting the hermetically sealed room. There were no windows, only smooth walls, and the space was filled with the latest generation of medical devices. Everything gleamed with a kind of clinical perfection that made John feel even more trapped. What is this place? Why am I here? His thoughts kept returning to the interrogation. The pain. The questions. He had endured it for 3 long days, 3 days of brutal torture at the hands of his captors, and he had told them nothing. But how had he escaped? Why was he alive? And why was Vass, the lieutenant who had given him his original orders, now sitting by his side, as though this was all part of some twisted plan? John's head throbbed, and he closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm of thoughts. He didn't have the strength to unravel the mystery now. The best thing he could do was wait for his body to heal, wait for answers. But the uneasy feeling in his chest told him that the truth, whatever it was, wouldn't be something simple. 10 minutes passed, the silence of the room broken only by the soft hum of machinery. John began to settle into the rhythm of the medical equipment, his mind wandering aimlessly as he floated in the regeneration fluid. But then, the door to the room slid open again. John's heart rate spiked as he strained to see who had entered. A figure stepped into the room, moving with a confident grace. She was tall, dressed in a sleek, black jumpsuit that hugged her form, but with no insignia or identification. Her steps were silent, precise. She moved with a poise and calm that immediately set John on edge. "Hi, John," she said, her voice smooth and casual, as though they were old friends. "I hope you're feeling better." John's body went cold. His mind snapped back to the interrogation room, the memory crashing into him like a tidal wave. That voice. It was the same voice that had haunted him for 3 days. The same voice that had questioned him endlessly, beaten him, tortured him, and tried to break him. His muscles tensed, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to fight, to escape, but he was powerless, trapped in the glass tube, his body too weak to even move. The woman noticed his reaction and smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent chills down John's spine. She moved closer to the tube, her eyes never leaving his as she studied him with a predatory calm. "Oh, you remember me, don't you?" she asked, her voice light and teasing. "Good. I was hoping you would." John's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at her, unable to respond, unable to move. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. How was she here? Why was she acting like they were on the same side? She took a step closer, placing her hand on the glass of the regeneration tube, her fingers splayed out as though she could reach through and touch him. Her eyes glittered with amusement as she watched him struggle. "You didn't say a word," she said softly, almost as though she admired him. 3 days of questioning, and not a single word. Impressive. But don't worry, this time, I won't be asking you any questions. John's pulse quickened, his body still frozen in shock as she moved around the tube, her footsteps echoing softly in the small room. She circled him like a predator, toying with him, savoring his helplessness. "Relax," she said, her voice still calm, still soft. "You're not my enemy. Not anymore." In fact, she paused, smiling again. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be. You rest and recover, we'll talk later." With that she turns to the door and leaves. The days passed in a haze of silence and recovery. John floated in the regeneration tube, his body healing from the brutal torture he had endured. The medical equipment hummed softly, monitoring his progress as his wounds slowly faded. The pain had dulled into an echo of what it once was, and his mind, though still burdened with questions, had grown accustomed to the strange limbo he found himself in. The woman, Sarah, her voice still haunted his thoughts. She had appeared at his bedside with that knowing smile, the same voice that had interrogated him for 3 days in a nightmare of pain and disorientation. She had said something that still gnawed at his consciousness, something that didn't make sense. It was all just a test. A test? John tried to make sense of it. Who would subject someone to 3 days of torture as a mere test? And for what purpose? The thought lingered in his mind as he waited, his body mending in the strange, warm liquid. For now, he had no choice but to trust that, soon enough, the answers would come. On the 6th day, the hum of the machine slowed, signaling that his body had fully recovered. John stirred, feeling strength return to his muscles. The aches had faded, his bruises all but vanished. He felt more alive than he had since before the abduction, but his mind remained alert, wary of what would come next. As if on cue, the door to the room slid open with a soft hiss. John turned his head, and there she was, Sarah. She stepped inside with the same confident grace, her black jumpsuit pristine, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they stood there in silence, her eyes scanning the machines before landing on him. "It's time, John," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "You're ready." With a slight nod, she moved to the control panel beside the regeneration tube, pressing a few buttons. The liquid began to drain, and John felt the weight of his own body return as the warmth of the tube's fluids receded. His limbs were still stiff from the long recovery, but his strength had returned. The glass lifted, and Sarah stepped forward to help him out of the tube. Her touch was firm but gentle as she guided him onto his feet. For a moment, John swayed, the feeling of solid ground beneath him foreign after so many days submerged in liquid. But he steadied himself, his instincts kicking in, his mind adjusting to his new state. "Here," Sarah said, handing him a black jumpsuit identical to hers. "Put this on." John took the jumpsuit and dressed in silence, his mind racing with questions, but he held them back. Now wasn't the time. He needed to understand more before he could confront her with the avalanche of confusion building in his mind. Once dressed, he stood before Sarah, who gave him a brief nod of approval. "Follow me," she said, motioning toward the door. Without hesitation, John followed. The two of them left the sterile, windowless room and stepped into a narrow corridor that stretched on in both directions. The walls were smooth, metallic, and featureless, the lighting dim. There were no windows, no signs of where they were. It could have been underground or deep within some fortified building. The atmosphere was thick with secrecy. Sarah moved silently, her footsteps barely making a sound as they walked down the corridor. John followed close behind, his eyes scanning his surroundings. The corridor seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to get a sense of direction. It was as if they were walking through a maze with no end in sight. Finally, they stopped in front of a large, featureless door. Sarah pressed her hand to a panel beside it, and with a soft click, the door slid open. She stepped inside, motioning for John to follow. He hesitated for a brief moment but then walked through the doorway. The room was starkly different from the rest of the facility. It was large and minimally furnished, with a single desk in the center and two chairs facing each other. The walls were made of the same smooth, metallic material as the corridor, but here, there was an air of purpose. This room wasn't just a part of the facility, it was where decisions were made, where things happened. There were no windows, no decorations, only the faint hum of hidden machinery that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Sarah gestured for John to sit. "Have a seat," she said, her voice now carrying a slight edge of formality. John moved cautiously to the chair and sat down, his eyes locked on her as she made her way to the other side of the desk. She sat opposite him, leaning forward slightly, her hands folded on the surface between them. For a moment, she studied him, her gaze cool and assessing. Then, she extended her hand, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Welcome, John," she said softly. "Welcome to the shadows of the night." John's heart skipped a beat. Shadows of the Night? He had never heard the name before, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't some ordinary military unit, and whatever he had been dragged into, it was far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "Everything you've been through, from your time at the academy to your recent experiences," she said, her voice calm and measured, "was all part of a test. A way to see if you were ready for something greater." John frowned, his mind racing to piece together what she was saying. "A test? You tortured me for 3 days, nearly broke me," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "And that was a test?" Sarah's expression softened, but the calm, calculating edge never left her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "We all went through it. Every member of the Shadows of the Night. It's not just physical endurance, John. It's about trust, resilience, and the ability to withstand the most extreme situations. You had to prove you were capable of surviving under the most brutal conditions without breaking. Without revealing anything." John's mind swirled with the weight of her words. A test. A sick, twisted trial. And somehow, he had passed. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "This isn't just another unit, John. The Shadows of the Night are different. We operate in the places no one else can. The shadows behind the curtains, the hands that steer the course of the Dominion from the darkness. We don't exist on the official records. We are the invisible force that protects the Dominion from threats both known and unseen." John sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. It was too much to process at once. Torture. Secrecy. And now, an invitation into some covert organization that operated outside the bounds of anything he had ever known. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice low. "Because you survived," Sarah replied. "You didn't break. You're stronger than most. And that's exactly what we need." The room fell into a heavy silence, Sarah's eyes locked on his. John stared back at her, still trying to grasp the enormity of what she was telling him. This was a new life. A new path. And the darkness he was being asked to step into seemed deeper than anything he had ever faced. The room was quiet, the sterile hum of machinery in the background the only sound as John Steele sat across from Sarah. His mind was still reeling from everything he had just learned. He had gone from a promising career in the Praetorian Guard to being pulled into a shadowy world he never knew existed. And the woman sitting before him, calm and composed, was now the guide into that world. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, seemed to bore into him, weighing every word, every movement. John broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. "So, how many organizations are there within the Praetorian Guard?" Sarah's lips curled into a faint smile, as if she had been waiting for the question. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest as she prepared to explain. "How many do you think there are, John?" she asked, her voice low but commanding. John didn't hesitate. "3, he answered. "The Golden Guard, who protect the royal family. The Eagles of the Homeland, who are tasked with safeguarding diplomats and critical political figures. And the Black Bear Company, who handle public order within the capital. That's what everyone knows." Sarah's smile widened slightly, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of someone holding back a secret. "That's what everyone knows, yes. But the truth, John, is that there's a fourth." John's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the information. A fourth company? He had never heard of such a thing. He leaned forward, every sense heightened as Sarah's tone grew more serious. "The fourth company," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, "is the one no one talks about. The one that doesn't exist in any official capacity. We are called the Shadows of the Night, and we operate directly under the Emperor's orders. No bureaucracy. No oversight. Just us and the Emperor's will." John's mind raced. A secret organization within the Praetorian Guard? It sounded impossible. How could something like this exist without anyone knowing? Sarah watched his reaction carefully, her gaze unwavering. "We deal with the Emperor's headaches. The things no one else can handle. The people who threaten the stability of the Dominion from the shadows. Criminals, rebels, traitors, those who the regular military, the public, and even the government don't need to know about. We rid society of its undesirables, swiftly and quietly." John felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't what he had signed up for. At the academy, he had trained for battle, for leadership, for the honor of serving in the Guard. But this was different. This was about eliminating threats in the dark, outside the boundaries of law and order. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah continued, her voice now laced with a hint of sarcasm. "I'll be honest, John. I don't know how you ended up here. Most of us in the shadows are seasoned veterans. We've been through wars, we've seen the worst the galaxy has to offer. You, on the other hand, you came straight from the academy. Someone must have pulled some strings for you, someone with influence." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But now that you're here, I'm going to take you under my wing. You're not a veteran, not yet, but I don't intend to let you die quickly. This life is brutal, and only the toughest survive." John clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure how to respond. Was this really where his path had led him? From a cadet with a bright future to a member of a secret organization that operated outside the law. Sarah leaned forward, her tone growing colder. "I'm going to explain something to you about how we operate. Our missions? They are dangerous. Deadly, even. But the upside is, we get to play with the newest toys the Empire has to offer, cutting-edge weapons, technology no one else even knows exists. We're equipped with the best, and we have free rein to do what needs to be done. That's the good part." She paused, her expression hardening, her voice turning deadly serious. "The bad part? Our missions are the ones no one else will touch. They're the kind that leave no margin for error. The kind where if you slip, if you hesitate, you die." John felt the tension in the air thicken as she stared directly into his eyes. "And here's the most important thing you need to know, John. We have one rule in the shadows. Everyone fights. No one stops. You stop, I'll kill you myself. Her words were delivered with icy finality. There was no hint of hesitation, no sign of hyperbole. John believed her. He could feel the cold resolve in her voice, the weight of someone who had seen and done unspeakable things. This was a world where hesitation was death and mercy was weakness. He swallowed, trying to keep his own resolve firm. I won't stop, he said, his voice steady but quieter than before. The gravity of what he was getting into weighed on him like a lead blanket, but he couldn't show weakness now. He was part of this, whether he liked it or not. Sarah studied him for a long moment, as if measuring his worth. Then she gave a curt nod. Good. Because once you're in, there's no going back. We handle the worst of the worst, John. This isn't a game. John nodded, though inside he felt like he was walking into a void of uncertainty. Everything about his future had been ripped out from under him and replaced with something far darker, something he didn't fully understand. Sarah's gaze softened just a fraction, her sharp tone easing. I'm not going to lie to you, John. Life in the shadows isn't easy. You're going to see things that will change you. You're going to make choices that will haunt you. But we do what needs to be done to protect the Dominion. We are the Emperor's sword in the night. With that, the two got up from their chairs and left the office. The cold light above flickered in the long corridor as John Steele followed Sarah deeper into the facility. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of his new reality pressed down harder with every passing moment. This was no longer the world he'd trained for at the academy, this was something far darker, far more dangerous. Sarah, calm and collected as always, led the way with the steady precision of someone who had long since made peace with the shadows they walked in. After a stretch of silence, she spoke. Her voice, though soft, carried a weight John had come to expect. There's another stage you'll have to go through before your real training begins, she said without turning back. John's curiosity flared, but there was an unease building within him as well. He had endured so much already, the brutal 3 days of torture, the revelation that he was now part of a shadowy organization no one knew existed. What more could they ask of him? What stage? John asked, his voice betraying a hint of apprehension. Sarah stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. Her eyes held a look of measured intensity, as though she was preparing him for something irreversible. You'll undergo an operation, she said plainly. John blinked, trying to make sense of the statement. An operation? Sarah nodded. Yes. This isn't just about survival anymore, John. It's about becoming something more. Something capable of thriving in the shadows we operate in. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it that made John's stomach twist. She continued, during the procedure, implants will be surgically embedded into your body. They'll enhance your abilities, your speed, your reflexes, even your vision. You'll be able to process information faster and react in ways you can't imagine now. Your body will become a weapon, sharpened to perfection. Everything you are will be improved by 1,000 times. The words hit John like a punch. His mind raced to catch up with the idea. Implants? Enhanced abilities? He had heard of military augmentations before, used sparingly in the Dominion's elite forces. But this? This sounded far beyond anything he'd been prepared for. And what are the risks? John asked, his voice low, steady despite the growing tension in his chest. Sarah's expression softened slightly. She wasn't heartless, but the truth in her eyes was cold. There are always risks when you push the body beyond its natural limits. Not everyone survives the procedure. Her tone was matter-of-fact, and John could sense she wasn't exaggerating. But you're strong. You survived 3 days of torture without breaking. I don't expect you to fail now. John processed the information in silence, weighing the risks, trying to steady himself. He was no stranger to danger, but this felt different. It wasn't just about surviving a fight or completing a mission. This was about giving up control, giving up parts of himself to become something else entirely. He clenched his jaw, forcing the hesitation out of his mind. "How long does it take to recover?" "About a week," Sarah replied, already turning back toward the corridor. "After that, we train. Then I'll show you exactly what the shadows of the night are capable of." John followed without another word. He'd made his choice already. Whatever this organization was, whatever it demanded of him, he was committed. He had no other option now. They walked in silence through the twisting, windowless corridors of the facility. The walls were cold, metallic, devoid of any decoration or sign of life beyond the sterile hum of hidden machines. John felt a growing sense of isolation as they passed through the maze-like structure, each turn leading them deeper into the unknown. Finally, they arrived at a set of reinforced doors, larger and more ominous than any John had seen before. Sarah placed her hand on a small panel by the door, and with a soft hiss, they slid open. Inside was a starkly lit room, far different from the rest of the facility. The room was dominated by a sleek operating table in the center, surrounded by advanced medical equipment that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Two medics, dressed in the same black jumpsuits as Sarah, stood at attention, their faces hidden behind dark visors. Everything about the room screamed precision and efficiency, but also danger. "This is it," Sarah said, stepping aside to let John take in the scene. "Once you go under, there's no going back. When you wake up, you'll be different. Better. Stronger." John stared at the table for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. "How long until?" "I'm ready." Sarah's voice softened, but her eyes remained as sharp as ever. "When you wake, you'll feel disoriented at first. Your body will feel foreign. Your reflexes will be faster than your mind can process. But it'll pass. You'll adjust." John nodded, though his mind was still swirling with uncertainty. The thought of waking up in a body that wasn't entirely his own was unsettling. But he had come too far to turn back now. He had no choice but to trust her, and to trust himself. Without another word, John approached the table and lay down, the cold metal surface pressing against his back. The medics moved in quickly, strapping him down with quiet efficiency. He didn't resist. He couldn't afford to. As they connected wires and tubes to his body, John took a deep breath, his heart racing. This was it. His last moment of control before everything changed. Sarah moved to his side, her expression unreadable but her presence strangely reassuring. "When you wake up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you'll be one of us." "Truly?" John stared up at the ceiling, the sterile white lights blurring as the anesthesia mask was placed over his face. Cool air rushed into his lungs, and within moments, the world around him began to fade. Sarah's words echoed in his mind as the darkness closed in. "From this moment on, you belong to the shadows of the night." Then, there was nothing. John's mind stirred in a fog of confusion, a haze of disjointed thoughts and sensations that floated just out of reach. His body felt heavy, weighed down by an unfamiliar numbness, as though he had been disconnected from his own skin. Slowly, he became aware of his surroundings, the warmth of liquid surrounding him, the rhythmic hum of machinery, the soft pulsing of something beneath the surface of his consciousness. He blinked, his vision blurred as his eyes struggled to adjust. The familiar glow of soft, sterile light filtered through the glass walls of the regeneration tube. He was back in the same room, the cold, clinical place where this new chapter of his life had begun. The last clear memory he had was lying on an operating table, Sarah's voice echoing in his ears. "When you wake up, you'll be one of us." Truly. Now, he was awake, and the words hung in the air like a distant echo. John's muscles protested as he tried to move, stiff from days of inactivity. The liquid that cradled him in the regeneration tube began to drain, and with it came the sensation of weight returning to his limbs. The glass canopy hissed open, allowing the crisp, sterile air of the room to wash over him. For a moment, he just sat there, disoriented, blinking against the harsh light as his senses slowly sharpened. He turned his head, the movement slow and deliberate, and through the lingering haze, he saw her, Sarah. She sat beside his tube, relaxed in a chair with one leg casually crossed over the other, her posture at ease but her eyes sharp and observant. She'd been waiting. As his vision cleared, her lips curved into a faint smile, though there was something detached in her expression. "Good," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "You're back among the living, John." John blinked again, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. His body felt alien, like a machine not yet fully under his control. He flexed his fingers slowly, watching them move, and though the motions were fluid, precise even, it felt strange. Too smooth. Too efficient. Sarah rose from her chair with graceful ease, crossing the small space between them in just a few steps. "Your implants are fully integrated into your system," she continued, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. The operation was a success. John opened his mouth to speak, but found that no words came out at first. His mind was still catching up, processing everything that had happened. Finally, after a beat, his voice emerged, rough and hoarse from disuse. "How long? How long was I out?" 3 days, Sarah replied, her tone casual, as though they were discussing nothing more than a routine medical procedure. "Your body needed time to recover from the trauma of the surgery and to adapt to the changes." Changes? John's mind latched onto the word, and he slowly swung his legs over the edge of the tube, planting his feet on the cold floor. The sensation was strange, his balance, his coordination, even the way his muscles responded to commands felt off, like they were too quick, too ready. He glanced at Sarah, uncertainty in his eyes. "And the implants?" His voice trailed off, still weak, but the question hung in the air. Sarah's smile widened slightly, though it never quite reached her eyes. "They've integrated perfectly with your system," she said. "You're faster now. Your reflexes, your strength, even your vision, all enhanced. You'll notice the difference soon enough." John looked down at his hands, flexing them once more. His fingers moved effortlessly, the muscles beneath his skin tightening with an almost mechanical precision. It was as though his body had been upgraded, fine-tuned in ways that he couldn't fully understand yet. The implants weren't just beneath his skin, they were part of him now. Part of everything he would become. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It feels different. Like my body's moving faster than my mind." "That's normal," Sarah said, stepping closer, her gaze locked onto his. "Your brain is still adjusting to the enhancements. Your reflexes are now beyond what most humans are capable of, so it'll take time for your mind to catch up to your body's new speed. But it will pass. You'll learn to control it." John nodded slowly, but deep down, he wasn't sure how to feel. His entire life, he'd trained to be a soldier, a guardian of the Dominion. But this? This was something else. Something beyond the boundaries of what he thought was possible. He was no longer just a soldier. He had been turned into something more. His gaze drifted to the medical equipment that lined the walls, the machine still humming with the quiet pulse of energy, and for a moment, he couldn't help but wonder, what had they turned him into? "You're stronger now," Sarah said, as though reading his thoughts. "Faster. Your senses are heightened. Your body can process information faster than ever before, and you'll find that your reactions are almost instantaneous. But that's just the beginning." John clenched his fists, testing the strength in his arms. The muscles responded perfectly, fluid and powerful. He felt like a coiled spring, ready to explode into action at the slightest provocation. It was exhilarating, but also deeply unsettling. "And now?" John asked, his voice stronger than before. Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Now, we start your real training," she said, her tone taking on a sharper edge. "The operation was only the first step. You've been given the tools to survive in the world we operate in, but tools are useless without the skills to wield them. That's what comes next." John met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. This was no ordinary training. The shadows of the night were not just soldiers, they were something else entirely. They didn't fight wars on open battlefields or patrol the streets like the Black Bear Company. They fought in the shadows, in the places where no one else could go. Where no one else dared to go. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. And the mission? What is it exactly that we do? Sarah's eyes narrowed, her tone growing more serious. We eliminate threats to the Empire before they can reach the surface. Rebels, traitors, criminals, anyone who poses a danger to the stability of the Dominion. The world doesn't know we exist, John, and that's the way it has to stay. We operate in the darkness, handling the Emperor's most sensitive problems. She paused, watching his reaction. We don't have the luxury of failure. The enemies we face don't play by the rules. And neither do we. John absorbed the gravity of her words. This was more than just being a soldier. It was about being an agent of the Empire's will, a tool for keeping the Dominion intact, by any means necessary. Sarah stepped closer, her voice lowering. This isn't just about fighting, John. It's about becoming someone else. The person you were before, the cadet, the soldier in training, that part of you is gone. What's left is the weapon we've made you into. John stared at her, the reality of her words sinking in like a cold weight in his chest. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this facility. He had been changed, transformed into something more dangerous, more lethal. But part of him wondered if he'd lost something in the process. Something human. Sarah seemed to sense his unease, and for a brief moment, her expression softened. I know this is a lot to take in, she said, her voice quieter now. You didn't choose this. But you were chosen for a reason. You survived the test, and now you've been given the chance to be something more. To make a difference. John nodded, though the words felt hollow. He knew he had no choice now. He was in too deep, too far gone to turn back. The only way forward was through the darkness. Sarah gestured toward the door, her posture returning to its usual sharpness. Rest a bit longer. When you're ready, we'll begin your training. And then I'll show you what the shadows of the night are truly capable of. With that, she turned and left the room, the door sliding shut behind her with a soft hiss. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of solitary routine and intense physical recovery. John spent his days training alone, pushing his newly enhanced body to its limits under the watchful eye of the facility's 2 doctors. They were efficient but distant, their only focus ensuring that his implants functioned as intended and that his body adjusted to the dramatic changes. Every morning, John ran a gauntlet of exercises designed to test his speed, strength, reflexes, and endurance. The implants had turned his body into a finely tuned weapon, and he could feel the improvements with every passing day. It wasn't just physical. John had to learn to control his heightened senses, the way every sound, every movement around him felt magnified. The doctors monitored his progress, noting how quickly his mind adapted to the new sensory input. He noticed his reflexes were lightning fast now, his vision sharper in the dark, and his body more resilient to fatigue. But even with the improvements, there was a constant tension, a battle to keep everything under control. When he wasn't training, John took the opportunity to explore. One morning, after a particularly grueling session in the training room, he found a set of narrow stairs leading to an exit he hadn't noticed before. Curiosity got the better of him, and he followed the path to an open hatch. The sunlight hit him like a wave, momentarily disoriented after so many days underground. As his eyes adjusted to the brightness, he realized that the facility, the headquarters of the Shadows of the Night, was located beneath what appeared to be an ordinary farm. A sprawling expanse of field stretched out before him, the sky a vast canvas of clear blue. From the outside, it looked peaceful, serene, like any other rural farm outside the capital. There were animals in pens, crops in neat rows, and a long dirt road winding toward the city in the distance. But John knew better now. Beneath the surface, deep underground, was something far more dangerous, the hidden fortress housing a secret organization that operated in the darkness, outside the knowledge of the world. It was a strange contrast, the calm of the farm and the deadly purpose of the underground base. John spent hours walking the perimeter, stretching his legs and letting the wind clear his head. But no matter how far he wandered, he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped, bound to a life that was no longer his own. The enhancements in his body made him feel powerful, but the isolation weighed on him. He was alone, surrounded by secrecy and shadows. The only person who broke the silence was Sarah. For 2 weeks, she stayed away, giving him space to recover and adjust. But John knew she was watching. Every day, he could feel her presence, lingering just out of reach. The real training hadn't started yet, but he knew it was coming. The countdown ticked in his mind, a constant reminder that everything so far had been just preparation. And then, the day arrived. John woke early that morning, the pale light of dawn filtering through the narrow vents in his room. He lay still for a moment, feeling the quiet hum of the facility around him. Cooler underground, the temperature controlled by unseen mechanisms. Today was different. It was the day he had been waiting for, his first real training with Sarah. John got up and headed for the shower, the cold water helping to clear his mind. His body felt strong, more responsive than ever before, but there was still a knot of uncertainty in his chest. He had no idea what to expect from Sarah's training, and part of him wondered if he was truly ready. He had spent weeks honing his new abilities, but this was the real test. After getting dressed in the standard black jumpsuit he had grown accustomed to, John made his way to the dining room. The room was quiet, with only the faint hum of machinery and the soft clink of dishes breaking the silence. He grabbed a simple breakfast from the counter, protein bars and a glass of water, and sat at a corner table. A few minutes later, the door slid open and Sarah entered. She moved with the same controlled grace, her eyes sharp and calculating, though there was a slight smile on her lips when she saw John. She carried her own tray and sat across from him without a word, digging into her meal with a soldier's efficiency. For a while, they ate in silence. John couldn't help but steal glances at her, wondering what she had planned for the day. Her demeanor was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sense of purpose that made him uneasy. He was about to ask her what the day would hold when she spoke first. "Are you ready for your first day of training?" Sarah's voice was smooth, but there was a challenge in her tone, as if she already knew the answer. John met her gaze, nodding. "I am." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her smile widening just slightly, but it never reached her eyes. "Good." She motioned for him to finish his breakfast, and when they were done, she stood, gesturing for him to follow. John's heart beat faster as he rose from the table, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. This was it. No more solitary training, no more doctors monitoring his progress. It was time for the real thing. Sarah led him through the familiar corridors of the underground facility, their footsteps echoing softly against the metallic floor. They passed through several security checkpoints, the walls smooth and featureless, the lighting dim. John's mind raced, his enhanced senses picking up every detail of the environment, every sound and shift of air around him. But despite the clarity of his perception, he had no idea what was waiting for him. They arrived at a large set of double doors, more imposing than the others John had seen in the facility. Sarah paused, her hand resting on the control panel for a moment before turning to him. Her face was unreadable, her eyes hard. "Once we go through these doors, John, your training truly begins. Everything you've done so far, everything you've learned, has been preparation. Today, you'll face real challenges, ones designed to push you beyond your limits." John nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected this, but the gravity of her words weighed on him. Sarah pressed her hand to the panel, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The room was enormous, much larger than he had anticipated, with various training modules spread across the space, obstacle courses, combat arenas, and sections dedicated to stealth and infiltration. It was a labyrinth of challenges, all designed to test every aspect of a soldier's abilities. "This," Sarah said, stepping forward, "is where the shadows are forged." John followed her into the chamber, his eyes scanning the space. There was a tension in the air, a sense of danger that made his pulse quicken. This wasn't just training, it was something far more intense. Sarah turned to face him, her posture rigid, her gaze cold and precise. "We don't have the luxury of normal training schedules here," she said, her voice sharp. "Every mission we undertake is a matter of life and death. We fight in the shadows, and the enemies we face don't follow the rules of war. If you hesitate, you die. If you doubt yourself, you fail. She stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. There are no second chances in the field, John. You'll either become one of us, or you won't make it out alive. John clenched his fists, steeling himself. He had already come this far. He couldn't back down now. Sarah's expression softened, but only slightly. You have potential, John. But potential means nothing if you can't master it. Today, we'll see what you're really made of. With that, she turned toward one of the training modules, motioning for him to follow. John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The first day of training had been deceptively simple, a few light sparring sessions, some target practice, and drills that felt almost routine. John had expected something more intense, but Sarah had told him it was just the beginning. That night, as he lay in his bed in the underground facility, he knew the real challenge was still ahead of him. And he was right. The next morning, John woke early, feeling the familiar weight of anticipation settle in his chest. After a quick shower, he dressed in his black jumpsuit and headed to the dining room for a quick breakfast. As he ate alone, his mind kept wandering back to the question that had been gnawing at him since his arrival. Who else was part of the shadows of the night? Surely he wasn't the only new recruit Sarah was training. After breakfast, John made his way to the training room. The hallways were quiet, the cold metallic walls absorbing the faint hum of machinery that filled the facility. When he reached the large reinforced doors, he took a deep breath before stepping inside. The room looked different today, less sterile and more lived in. The training modules that had seemed intimidating yesterday now felt like part of his new routine. But what caught his attention were the 4 figures already waiting inside. As John entered the room, they all turned to face him. He paused for a moment, taking them in. These were his teammates, his new family in the shadows of the night. He felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He had spent weeks training alone, but now, everything was about to change. Sarah stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the interaction closely, but she didn't say anything yet. Instead, one of the 4 stepped forward. He was tall, easily a few inches taller than John, with broad shoulders, blonde hair, and striking blue eyes. There was something about his confident stride and the glint in his eye that screamed trouble. He wore a wide grin as he walked up to John and offered his hand. "Mark," he said, his voice loud and full of energy. "I'm the weapons specialist around here. Guns, knives, explosives, you name it, I've mastered it. And now, you get the privilege of learning everything I know." He winked, his grin widening as if he'd just told a joke only he found funny. John couldn't help but smile back, shaking Mark's hand. There was a kind of wildness about him, a spark of recklessness that reminded John of the soldiers back at the academy who were always looking for a thrill. He could tell that working with Mark was going to be interesting. "Looking forward to it," John said, trying to match Mark's energy. "Damn right you are," Mark replied, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Stick with me, and you'll be shooting targets before they even know they're in your sights." Before John could respond, another figure stepped forward, this one much quieter. "Son," he said, his voice low and measured. He was shorter than John, with sharp Asian features and a focused intensity in his eyes. His movements were precise, almost methodical, as though every action was calculated. "Explosive specialist." Son's handshake was firm but quick, and he immediately stepped back, as though he preferred to stay in the background. John got the sense that Son was someone who didn't waste words, a man of few but carefully chosen actions. There was a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need to be shown off. "Good to meet you," John said, nodding. Son simply nodded back, his face impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes on approval, maybe. John wasn't sure, but he could tell Son would be someone he could rely on in the heat of a mission. The next person to approach had a more imposing presence. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark eyes, his features sharp and stern. His skin was tanned, and John could tell from the way he carried himself that he was someone who had seen his share of conflict. "Salah," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Counterintelligence specialist." Salah's handshake was brief, but there was a sense of gravitas to it, as though each movement carried the weight of his experience. He had the air of someone who had been through the worst and came out stronger on the other side. His expression was stoic, and John could tell that Salah was someone who kept his emotions tightly controlled. "I'll teach you how to see through lies, gather intelligence, and manipulate the enemy," Salah continued. "But understand this, trust is earned, not given." John nodded, appreciating the directness. "Understood." And then, the last member of the team stepped forward. She was smaller than the others, with short, dark hair and sharp European features. What immediately caught John's attention, though, was her smile. It was bright and friendly, almost out of place in such a serious setting. She extended her hand with a warm grin. "Marta," she said, her voice light but confident. "I'm a cybernetics specialist. If it's digital, I can hack it. If it's got wires, I can fix it. And if it's got gears, well, let's just say I can make it do things it's not supposed to." John shook her hand, feeling slightly disarmed by her casual demeanor. She was so different from the others, where they were intense, calculated, or stoic. She seemed cheerful, almost playful. But John knew better than to be fooled by appearances. Anyone in the shadows of the night had earned their place, and if Marta was part of this team, it was for a good reason. "I hope you're ready to learn," Marta added, her eyes twinkling. "Because with me you'll need to keep up." "I'll try," John replied, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Finally, Sarah stepped forward. She hadn't introduced herself yet, but John already knew what her specialty was. He had seen it in the way she moved, the way she commanded the room with a quiet authority. "And I'll be teaching you hand-to-hand combat," she said, her voice steady. "It's not just about strength, John. It's about precision. Speed. Understanding your opponent and making sure they never get the upper hand. You'll learn from all of us, but if you don't master the basics of close combat, you won't last long in the field." John nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about becoming the best version of himself, faster, stronger, and smarter than he had ever been before. And now, he had a team to back him up. Over the next month, John threw himself into the training. Each day was filled with grueling drills, each designed to push him to his limits in ways he hadn't thought possible. He spent hours learning about weapons from Mark, everything from standard-issue rifles to more exotic, specialized gear that the Dominion kept under wraps. Mark's enthusiasm for all things destructive was infectious, and John found himself absorbing knowledge faster than he expected. With Sun, John learned the delicate art of explosives. Sun was quiet but meticulous, teaching him not just how to set charges, but how to disarm them, and how to understand the science behind the explosion. Every lesson was a test in patience and precision. Salah, true to his stoic nature, taught John the subtleties of counterintelligence. It wasn't just about gathering information, it was about reading people, understanding motivations, and knowing when to manipulate, when to press, and when to back off. John learned quickly that Salah's lessons were more mental than physical, but no less exhausting. Marta, always smiling, taught John how to navigate the digital landscape. Hacking, cybersecurity, drone operations, she made it all seem so effortless. But behind her easygoing nature, John realized just how dangerous she could be. With a few keystrokes, Marta could turn the tide of any mission, and John had to keep up with her rapid-fire lessons. And then there was Sarah. Every morning, she drilled him relentlessly in hand-to-hand combat. Her movements were fluid and precise, every punch and kick delivered with deadly accuracy. John struggled to keep up at first, but under her tutelage, he began to understand the rhythm of the fight. She pushed him harder than anyone, never giving him an inch, and by the end of each session, his body ached in ways he didn't think possible. As the days passed, John realized something important. Even though each of them had their specialties, they all knew how to do everything. They were more than just a team of specialists, they were each capable of handling any situation, no matter how dangerous or unpredictable. And now, John had to learn from them. Every lesson, every drill, was a step toward becoming a full-fledged member of the Shadows of the Night. The month that followed was a whirlwind of training, each day a new trial that pushed John further than he had ever thought possible. He learned not only how to survive in the shadows, but how to thrive. The team around him, their skills, their experience, became his foundation. But now, after weeks of drills and lessons, it was time for the real test. It was early morning when John woke, his body already accustomed to the strict routine. The once foreign enhancements in his body had become second nature. His reflexes were sharper, his senses heightened, and his movements fluid. He had spent weeks sparring with Sarah in close-quarters combat, working alongside Mark in mastering weapons, and learning how to disarm explosives with Sunday. Marta had shown him how to manipulate systems and drones with surgical precision, while Salah drilled into him the intricacies of reading people, gathering intel, and staying 3 steps ahead of any opponent. As John got dressed, pulling on his black jumpsuit, he could feel the weight of the day ahead. This wasn't just another training exercise. Today, they had something more dangerous in store. After a quick shower and a bite to eat, John made his way to the training room. The rest of the team was already gathered there, waiting. Mark leaned casually against a wall, grinning as always, his energy radiating even in the quiet moments. Sun sat on a bench, calmly adjusting a piece of equipment. Salah stood by the far end, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room as if he were always looking for hidden threats. Marta, cheerful as ever, was tapping away at a small tablet, no doubt preparing for whatever tech-heavy challenge awaited them today. And Sarah, of course, stood at the front of the room, her expression serious as always, ready to lead them into the fire. John stepped in, and the team turned toward him, the air thick with anticipation. "Good morning, John," Sarah said, her tone neutral, but there was an intensity in her gaze. "Today is different." John nodded, his body already tensing in response. He knew she was about to push him harder than before. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just about testing his skills, it was about seeing if he could hold up when things got truly dangerous. "Today, you'll be working as part of the team," Sarah continued. "The drills are over. We're moving to live exercises. You've learned a lot in the past few weeks, but now we need to see if you can handle the pressure when it counts." John's heart quickened. Live exercises meant real danger. Real consequences. He knew the team wouldn't put him in a situation he couldn't handle, but the stakes had just been raised. He'd been prepared for this, but that didn't make the coming trial any easier. "Clear." Mark grinned as he stepped forward, clapping John on the shoulder. "Don't worry, John boy. You'll be fine. Just remember everything I taught you about shooting and try not to blow up on your first day." His tone was light, but John could see the flicker of seriousness in his eyes. This was a test not just for John, but for the team. Sun stood up, adjusting the straps on his tactical vest. "We'll be using live explosives today. Stay sharp and stay focused. I won't let you get hurt, but you need to follow my lead when it comes to disarmament. Everything you do today has a ripple effect," Salah said, his voice calm but firm. "Every move you make impacts the team. Stay vigilant and don't underestimate your opponents." John nodded, taking it all in. His team had his back, but this wasn't just about surviving the exercise, it was about proving himself. He had come a long way, but now he had to show them that he belonged. That he could operate in the shadows alongside them. Marta, always smiling, walked over to him, holding up her tablet. "I've already set up some surprises for you in the system, John. Think of it as a digital maze. Your task is to navigate it without tripping over any wires. Think you're ready?" John gave her a small grin. "I've had a good teacher." She winked at him and stepped back. "Let's hope you remember the lessons." Sarah motioned for the group to gather around. "We've set up a scenario in the training complex. It's a simulated mission, but it's as close to real as we can make it. Hostages, armed combatants, explosives, and time pressure. John, you'll be acting as a member of the team, and the decisions you make will affect the outcome of the exercise." John felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. This was no ordinary drill. It was a mission, a glimpse of what the real world would be like once he and the team were deployed on actual operations. The goal, Sarah continued, is to secure the hostages and eliminate the threat. The building is rigged with traps, and the enemy will respond to your movements. This is about coordination, strategy, and execution. You've learned enough to get through this, but only if you work as part of the team. She paused, her eyes locking onto John's. Remember, in the shadows, you're only as strong as the people next to you. Trust your team. Trust yourself. John nodded, his body humming with adrenaline. He wasn't just being tested on his own skills, he was being tested on his ability to operate within the team. He would need to rely on them just as much as they would rely on him. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. Let's begin. The team geared up, strapping on their tactical vests and checking their weapons. John followed their lead, the weight of the gun in his hand feeling natural now after weeks of training with Mark. His senses were sharp, every sound, every movement in the room amplified by his implants. He could feel the tension building as they prepared for the exercise, but there was also a quiet confidence in the air. This was what they had trained for. The doors to the training complex opened, revealing a dimly lit corridor ahead. The space beyond looked like an abandoned industrial facility, narrow hallways, rusted metal beams, and flickering lights. The sound of distant machinery echoed through the walls, adding to the sense of unease. Somewhere in there, hostages were waiting to be rescued. And somewhere, enemies were waiting to strike. Sarah moved to the front, signaling for the team to follow. They entered the complex in formation, each member falling into their assigned roles with practiced ease. John was in the middle of the group, his senses on high alert, his heart pounding as he scanned the surroundings. Mark was on point, his weapon raised as he checked each corner with quick, efficient movements. Salah followed close behind, his eyes scanning for any signs of surveillance or traps. Sun brought up the rear, his hands already adjusting the detonators and disarmament tools he carried. Marta moved in near silence, her tablet in hand as she worked to disable security systems and scramble communications. They moved as one, each step calculated, each breath measured. As they reached the first intersection, Mark raised a fist, signaling a halt. He gestured to John. "Your turn, John boy. Hostiles ahead. You take point." John's pulse quickened, but he nodded, stepping forward. He knew this moment would come, he'd have to take charge, make the calls. He moved to the front, raising his weapon as he crept down the corridor, every muscle tense, every sense heightened. His new implants hummed in the background, amplifying his reflexes, sharpening his perception. The corridor twisted ahead, and as John rounded the corner, he spotted them, two armed figures standing guard near a door. John crouched, signaling for the team to hold back. He calculated his next move quickly, taking out the guards quietly would ensure they didn't trigger any alarms. He aimed, breathing steady, and fired two quick shots, the suppressor on his gun ensuring the sound was little more than a whisper. The guards dropped without a sound. John glanced back at the team, receiving approving nods from Mark and Salah. His confidence John pushed the door open, revealing a larger room beyond, hostages, tied and bound, their eyes wide with fear. But across the room, a group of hostiles stood waiting, weapons drawn. Sarah's voice rang out, calm but commanding. "Time to see what you've learned, John." The fight was on. The room erupted into chaos the moment John pushed through the door. The hostiles had been waiting, their weapons already trained on the hostages. In the split second it took for John to register the scene, the enemy raised their rifles, ready to fire. Instinct kicked in. John dove for cover behind a large steel crate, his movements faster and more precise than they had ever been. His enhanced reflexes took over, his body reacting almost before his mind could process the danger. Bullets whizzed past him, ricocheting off the walls with a sharp metallic ring. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins as he glanced back at the team. Sarah, always calm in the heat of battle, signaled to the others with a quick, decisive gesture. In an instant, they spread out, each member moving with fluid precision. Mark slid into position beside John, his rifle ready, a wide grin plastered across his face as though he lived for moments like this. "Well, John boy," he muttered, "welcome to the show." John smirked despite the tension. He peeked around the edge of the crate, assessing the situation. The hostages, 4 civilians bound to chairs, fear etched across their faces, sat in the center of the room. 6 hostiles stood around them, guns drawn and shouting commands in a language John didn't recognize. 2 more guards were stationed near the exits, scanning the room for any sign of the team. "Son," John whispered into his comms, "any chance of disarming whatever they've rigged on the hostages?" On it, Son's calm voice came through. "Just need a distraction." John turned to Mark, who was already itching for action. "I'll draw their fire," John said. "You take out the guards near the door. We need those exits clear." Mark gave him a wild grin, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "You got it, John boy." John took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was his first real test, live fire, real enemies, real stakes. He had trained for weeks, pushing his body and mind to the limit, but this was different. If he made a mistake here, people would die. But he wouldn't fail. John surged out from behind the crate, sprinting across the open space to the next piece of cover. As he moved, the hostiles opened fire, their attention now focused on him. He could feel the heat of the bullets as they zipped past him, but his enhanced reflexes made his movements almost effortless. His mind processed the danger in real time, calculating the angle of each shot and the distance to his next target. He slid into cover behind a large metal beam, firing off 2 quick shots as he went. One of the hostiles dropped, the shot clean and precise. The other enemies shouted in panic, realizing they were under attack from all sides. Mark, as promised, took out the guards near the doors with swift, well-placed shots. The exits were clear now, but the real danger still lay ahead. John glanced over at Son, who was moving with silent precision, inching his way toward the hostages while the rest of the team kept the enemy distracted. Salah was already at work, his eyes scanning the room, analyzing the hostiles' movements. He called out orders over the comms, directing the team with the cool efficiency of a man who had been in too many firefights to count. "John, flank right. Take out the 2 near the control console. Sarah, getting close, disable their leader." John followed the instructions without hesitation. He moved right, staying low as he advanced on the 2 hostiles guarding the console. They were distracted, trying to track the source of the gunfire, their eyes darting from one corner of the room to the other. John didn't give them a chance to react. He fired twice, 2 headshots, clean and quick. The hostiles crumpled to the ground. Across the room, Sarah moved with deadly precision, her figure almost a blur as she closed in on the leader of the group. John watched, momentarily stunned by her speed and grace. Sarah didn't even bother with her gun. In one swift motion, she disarmed the leader, twisting the weapon from his grip and knocking him unconscious with a single strike to the temple. John blinked, realizing that even with his enhancements, he still had a long way to go to match her. "Hostiles neutralized," Salah's voice cut through the comms. "Son, status on the hostages?" Son was already at the center of the room, crouched over the hostages, his hands moving deftly as he worked to disarm the explosives rigged beneath their chairs. His calm demeanor never wavered, even as the clock ticked down. "Almost done," Son replied, his voice as steady as ever. "Just keep the area clear." John and Mark stood guard as Son worked. Marta, stationed near the entrance, was busy disabling any external alarms or traps the hostiles might have left behind. Her fingers flew across her tablet, her face serious and focused. After what felt like an eternity, Son let out a small breath. "Disarmed. Hostages are secure." The tension in the room began to ease as the last threat was neutralized. John felt his muscles relax slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His heart was racing, but the mission was a success. His first live exercise with the team, and they had completed it without a hitch. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room with a critical gaze. She nodded to the team. Good work. Hostages secure, all targets eliminated. Efficient and clean. Exactly what I expected from you. Her eyes locked onto John, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was a glint of approval in her expression. Not bad for your first run, John. John felt a surge of pride but kept his expression neutral. Thanks. But, she continued, her tone sharpening, this was just the beginning. That was a simulation, a controlled environment. In the field, things won't go this smoothly. You won't always have time to plan. There will be chaos. And you'll need to adapt. She paused, her gaze intense. We're not like the others, John. The shadows of the night don't have backup. We don't call for reinforcements. It's just us, and if we fail, no one will know. There's no glory in this job. Only survival. Remember that. John nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't about winning medals or earning recognition. This was about life and death, operating in the darkest corners of the Dominion where failure meant disappearing into the void without a trace. Sarah motioned for the team to regroup. Take 5. We debrief in the next room. The rest of the team began to gather their gear, but John stood for a moment longer, staring at the room where the simulated hostages had been. It felt so real, the fear in their eyes, the adrenaline of the fight. If it had been a real mission, would they have survived? Would he have made the right calls? He shook off the thought and turned to follow the team. He knew there was no point in second-guessing himself. He had survived his first test, and that was enough for today. As he walked out of the room, he couldn't help but feel that, despite the victory, the real challenges were still ahead of him.
If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel and press the like button, it helps me a lot, thank you very much.
It was the end of a long, grueling week. John's first live exercise had gone well, and the team had completed their debrief without a hitch. After days of intense training and high-pressure missions, Sarah decided it was time for John's official welcome to the team. To John's surprise, the plan wasn't more drills or another covert operation, it was a night out at a bar just outside the capital. The team's choice of venue was a small, unassuming bar nestled in a quiet district on the outskirts of Nova Lux. The dim lighting and worn leather booths gave it a laid-back atmosphere, far removed from the sterile confines of their underground facility. It wasn't the kind of place John had expected from the shadows of the night, but maybe that's what made it perfect. It was normal, at least, as normal as things got for them. John found himself seated at a booth with the rest of the team. For the first time, he noticed something different about them. Mark, Sun, Salar, Marta, and even Sarah looked relaxed, the weight of their work momentarily lifted. The atmosphere was casual, far from the intensity of the training room or the battlefield. John boy, Mark began, raising his whiskey with a grin, tonight's all about you. You've survived your first run with us, so consider this your official welcome to the shadows. Just don't think you're off the hook for the next round of drinks. John chuckled, feeling a bit of the tension ease from his shoulders. He had been part of the team for weeks now, but there was something about this moment that made it feel real. The field test had been his initiation, and now, he was truly one of them. Drinks arrived, and the conversation shifted away from work. For the first time, the team seemed like more than just operatives, they were real people, with lives, families, and stories beyond the shadows they moved in. Marta, the team's ever-smiling cybernetics expert, leaned forward with her drink in hand. All right, John, you've got the skills, you've got the implants, and now you're one of us. But we still don't know much about you. What's your story? John hesitated for a moment. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk about his past, it was just that, compared to the others, his life felt complicated. Still, he figured it was time to share a bit more. Well, John began, taking a sip of his drink, I didn't exactly have a normal childhood. My birth mother died during childbirth, and my father, well, he's unknown. I was adopted when I was 3 months old by my parents, the ones who raised me. The team listened in silence, giving John the space to continue. My father is a captain in the Dominion Navy, John explained. He commands a heavy cruiser, and he's usually deployed, so I didn't see him much growing up. My mother's a university professor, teaches history. She's the one who was really there for me when I was younger. There was a beat of silence before Marta leaned in, her smile softening. That's a lot to take in, especially when you're that young. But it sounds like you've got good parents. John nodded, grateful for the life his adoptive parents had given him. Yeah, they're good people. They took me in and gave me a home. I also have a younger sister, she's in high school now. She's smart, probably the smartest in the family, but we're close. Mark, who had been listening intently, raised an eyebrow. A sister? So does she know what her big brother's really doing, or is she under the impression you're just some regular soldier? John smiled. She thinks I'm still in the Praetorian Guard, like everyone else. It's easier that way. Salah, always the calm and thoughtful one, chimed in. You're protecting them by keeping it that way. The life we live, it's not something most people can understand. Sarah, who had been watching the conversation unfold, gave a small nod of agreement. Secrecy is as much about protection as it is about duty. Your family doesn't need to carry the burden of knowing what you do. John let her words sink in. He had always struggled with the distance that came with the secrecy of his work, but he knew Sarah was right. It was better this way, for his sister, for his parents. They didn't need to know what he had become. It was a burden he had chosen to carry alone. So, Marta said, breaking the heavy moment with a playful smile, how does a kid from a naval family end up in the shadows? That's quite a leap. John shrugged. I enlisted early. I wanted to do something meaningful, make a difference. I was always drawn to the military, maybe because of my dad, but the more I trained, the more I felt like I could do more. The Praetorian Guard seemed like the best way to serve. He paused, taking another sip of his drink. But then, something changed. I was pulled into this. Someone decided I belonged here, and now, well, here I am. Mark, grinning as usual, raised his glass. From adopted kid to shadow warrior. Not a bad origin story, John boy. John laughed, but Marta wasn't done. And what about your sister? Is she following in your footsteps, or is she planning on becoming the next great scientist? John shook his head with a smile. No, she's too smart for the military. She's planning to go to university. Maybe something in engineering or medicine. She hasn't decided yet, but whatever she does, she'll be good at it. Son, who had been quietly listening, offered a rare smile. She sounds like she's got a good head on her shoulders. Yeah, John said, feeling a sense of pride in his sister. She's going to do great things. The conversation shifted after that, with each member of the team taking their turn to share a bit of their personal history. Salah, always the stoic figure, surprised John by opening up about his upbringing in the Middle East. I grew up in a place where war was part of life, he said quietly. I joined the military to protect my family, my home. But after years of fighting, I realized things weren't as simple as I thought. Marta smiled at him softly. That's how a lot of us ended up here. It's never simple. Salah nodded in agreement, his eyes dark. War makes you see the world differently. It's why I'm here, because in the shadows, things are clear. We do what needs to be done. John found himself respecting Salah even more. Behind that quiet exterior was a man who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer and had come out the other side, hardened but resolute. Mark, never one to dwell on seriousness for long, cut in with his own story, told in his typical over-the-top fashion. Grew up in the north, cold, brutal winters, but it makes you tough. I've always been good with weapons, so naturally, I ended up here. Figured if I was going to be good at something, I might as well be the best. You need something blown up, shot, or otherwise destroyed, I'm your man. Everyone laughed, knowing full well Mark's enthusiasm for destruction. Marta leaned forward, her playful tone never leaving her. And I, as you know, was a troublemaker in my youth. Hacked into systems I shouldn't have, messed with government programs, until the Dominion found me and gave me an ultimatum: work for us, or get thrown into a cell. You can guess which option I chose. John smiled. Smart choice. Sarah, as always, remained quiet, her presence more observant than participatory. She nursed her drink slowly, a distant look in her eyes. John wondered what secrets lay behind her stoic exterior, but he knew better than to pry. Whatever her story was, she'd share it when the time was right, if that ever happened. As the night wore on, the drinks kept flowing, and the atmosphere grew more relaxed. For the first time since John had joined the shadows of the night, he felt like he was part of something real, part of a family. The camaraderie was undeniable, forged through shared danger, trust, and the knowledge that they had each other's backs. Mark raised his glass one last time, his grin as wide as ever. To John Boy, our newest recruit. May you survive long enough to buy us the next round. Laughter echoed around the table as they all clinked their glasses together. And for the first time in a long time, John felt a deep sense of belonging. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wasn't facing them alone. The shadows had become his family now. And in the darkness of their world, that was the only thing that mattered. The night had been light-hearted, filled with laughter, stories, and drinks. John had begun to feel more connected to his new team, the shadows of the night, and for a brief moment, the weight of their dangerous work had lifted. But as they sat around the table in the dimly lit bar, that fragile sense of normalcy shattered. Sarah's phone buzzed on the table, its vibrations cutting through the conversation. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening almost instantly. Her posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing with the sharp focus that John had come to recognize as her mission mode. The easygoing air she'd carried moments earlier evaporated, replaced by the hardened professionalism of a commander ready for action. "It's time," Sarah said, her voice low but commanding. She stood from the table, her movements precise and deliberate, and motioned for everyone to follow her. The rest of the team exchanged quick glances, but didn't hesitate. They knew what this meant: the first mission had finally arrived. John's heart raced as he pushed his chair back and followed Sarah out of the bar, his mind already shifting into a state of alertness. The weeks of training had all led to this moment, and now it was real. No more simulations. No more drills. This was the field, the real world, where mistakes had deadly consequences. They moved quickly, navigating through the quiet streets of the capital and back to their headquarters. Within 20 minutes, they were descending into the underground facility, the cold, metallic walls of the base greeting them like a familiar shadow. The light-heartedness of the bar was far behind them now. Sarah led them into a large, dimly lit briefing room. The space was dominated by a massive circular table in the center, and as they entered, the room came alive with a low hum. A large hologram flickered to life above the table, casting a cold blue glow over their faces. The hologram was of the Shillong sector, a distant region on the edge of the Empire, marked by vast asteroid belts and industrial stations. John had never been there, but he had heard of it, a lawless place, far from the central authority of the Dominion. Sarah took her position at the head of the table, her eyes fixed on the hologram. "We've received our orders directly from the Emperor," she began, her tone brisk and no-nonsense. "This mission is an assassination. The target, Duke Darius Cool." John blinked, absorbing the information. He had heard of Duke Darius, an influential noble with ties to various sectors on the fringes of the Empire. But what Sarah said next caught him off guard. "Duke Darius has been dealing in the black market trade of deridium," she explained. Deridium, as you all know, is the primary fuel used in starships throughout the Empire. The Duke has been siphoning it off and selling it illegally, causing a disruption in the supply chain. More importantly, he lured Prime Minister Antony Arama's son, Antony Jr., into this business. The Prime Minister's son was killed during a recent transaction gone wrong. The room grew still as the significance of her words sank in. The Prime Minister was one of the most powerful men in the Dominion, second only to the Emperor himself. To harm his family was to commit a grave offense against the Empire. The Prime Minister is a close ally of the Emperor, Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping over the team. And the Emperor has decided it's time for Duke Darius to be eliminated. Not just because of the illegal trade, but because Darius has been openly opposing the Emperor's policies. He's become a threat, a symbol of opposition. John's mind raced as Sarah laid out the stakes. This wasn't just about taking out a corrupt noble. It was about removing a political threat to the Emperor's rule. This mission will achieve two things, Sarah said, her voice cold and efficient. We remove the Duke from power, and we send a message to anyone else thinking of challenging the Emperor. The hologram shifted, zooming in on the Shillong sector, where Duke Darius had set up his base of operations. It was a heavily fortified industrial compound located on an asteroid deep within the sector. The complex was surrounded by layers of security, from automated defenses to private mercenaries loyal to the Duke. Sarah continued, pointing to the hologram. Our objective is clear. Infiltrate the compound, eliminate Duke Darius, and extract any sensitive data regarding his black market dealings. The Emperor wants this handled quietly, no public execution, no spectacle. We get in, we eliminate him, and we leave. The opposition won't even have time to react. John stared at the glowing map, feeling the tension in the room build. The mission was as dangerous as it was delicate. One wrong move, and the entire sector could erupt into chaos. Not to mention, they would be operating on the edge of the Empire, far from any support or reinforcements. Mark, who had been listening intently, leaned forward, his usual grin absent. How's the security detail? Are we walking into a war zone? Sarah nodded. Duke Darius has a sizable private army. Mercenaries. They're well-armed and well-trained, but they're not loyal to him, they're loyal to his money. That's our advantage. They're not fighting for a cause. They're fighting for a paycheck. Salah, always the quiet observer, finally spoke up. We'll need to disable his communications before we strike. If he gets word out, reinforcements could flood in from nearby sectors. And if any of his associates learn what's happening, they could retaliate. Exactly, Sarah said. That's why Marta will be a running point on cybersecurity. She'll be disabling their comms, security systems, and any external monitoring. Without those, the compound is blind. Marta, sitting beside Salah, gave a nod. I'll have everything locked down. They won't know we're there until it's too late. Sun, who had been reviewing the hologram's details, tapped the table. What about explosives? Is the compound rigged? We're expecting heavy defenses, Sarah replied. But that's where you come in, Sunday. You'll need to disarm any traps or explosive devices along our path. Sun nodded, his face impassive. I'll handle it. John remained silent, listening carefully. This was his first rail mission with the team, and the gravity of it weighed heavily on him. Duke Darius was no small target. Taking him out wouldn't just mean eliminating a single man, it would destabilize an entire faction, a ripple that would send shockwaves through the Empire. Finally, Sarah turned to John. Your role is crucial, John. You'll be with me when we infiltrate the Duke's inner sanctum. Once inside, we'll neutralize him quickly and efficiently. I'll need you to cover me while I take the shot. John felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through him. This was it, the real thing. He had trained for this moment, but now it was happening, and the pressure was intense. He nodded, his voice steady. Understood. Sarah looked around the room, her gaze lingering on each of them. This mission has the Emperor's full backing, but we need to act carefully. No mistakes. No hesitation. If we do this right, we'll be in and out before anyone realizes what happened. She straightened up, her eyes hard. This is what we've trained for. It's time to prove that the shadows of the night are more than just rumors. We're the Emperor's sword in the darkness. And tonight, that sword falls on Duke Darius. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mark broke the tension with a wry grin. Well then, let's go kill a duke. The team stood, gathering their gear as the hologram blinked off. John's heart pounded in his chest as he strapped on his tactical vest, checking his weapon and mentally preparing himself for the mission ahead. As they moved toward the exit, Sarah stopped him for a brief moment. She looked at him, her expression softer than usual, but still focused. "This is your first mission, John. Stay sharp, stay focused, and trust your training. We've got your back." John nodded, his resolve firming. "I won't let you down." With that, Sarah led the team toward the hangar where their ship awaited, ready to take them to the Shillong sector. The team boarded their stealth ship, the hum of the engines filling the hangar as they prepared to launch. The darkened bay lights flickered as the ship's systems came online. The hum of the engines reverberated through the stealth ship as it hurtled toward the Shillong sector, the low vibrations filling the cabin like a steady heartbeat. John sat in silence, his body strapped to the cold metal seat, his pulse quickening with every passing moment. The darkened interior was bathed in the dim glow of red emergency lighting, casting long shadows across the faces of his teammates. He felt the weight of the mission bearing down on him, heavier than the tactical gear strapped to his chest. It was real now, no more simulations or training exercises. The mission was live, and they were headed into enemy territory to carry out an assassination ordered directly by the Emperor. Duke Darius Cool, a noble with dangerous ambitions and ties to the black market, had to be eliminated. The Duke had overstepped, meddling in the illegal trade of duridium and, worse, involving the Prime Minister's son in his schemes, resulting in the young man's death. The Emperor had made his decision, and now it was up to the shadows of the night to carry it out. John's mind raced as the ship sped through the void. His heart thudded in his chest, the anticipation building. He had trained for weeks, every day preparing for a moment like this, but the thought of pulling the trigger on an assassination mission made the weight of his role even heavier. There would be no room for mistakes. Mark, seated across from John, leaned forward, his usual cocky grin replaced by a sharp focus. "You all right there, John boy?" he asked, breaking the tense silence that had filled the ship. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but his tone was still light, as if trying to ease the tension. John nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, just thinking." Mark chuckled softly. "Try not to think too much before a mission. It'll eat you alive. When we land, let the training take over." John gave him a small nod, though the anxiety still gnawed at him. This was his first real mission. The shadows operated on the edge of the Dominion's rules, doing the Emperor's dirty work from the shadows, cleaning up problems that could destabilize the Empire. Now, John was part of that machine. He glanced over at Sarah, who stood near the cockpit, speaking quietly with the pilot. Her posture was calm, her movements controlled. The leader of the team, Sarah, had done this countless times before, but John could see the tension in her shoulders, the responsibility weighing on her. She caught John's gaze, gave him a small nod, and turned back to the pilot. "We're entering the Shillong sector now," the pilot's voice crackled over the comm system. "Engaging stealth mode." The ship's hum quieted, the lights dimming as the vessel slipped into stealth mode. John peered through the small window beside him, watching as the distant lights of the Shillong sector came into view. The asteroid field that marked the perimeter of Duke Darius territory loomed ahead, a sprawling network of industrial facilities and defense systems spread across jagged rocks. Sarah moved back to the center of the cabin, her voice steady as she addressed the team. "We're 20 minutes out from the target. Everyone knows their role. Stick to the plan, and we'll be in and out before anyone knows we were there. Marta, you'll disable their surveillance and external defenses. Son, you'll handle any traps or explosives along the way. Salah, you'll manage internal comms and security overrides. Mark, you're on combat detail, keep the mercenaries off us. John, you're with me. We'll take out the Duke." John nodded, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline as the plan solidified in his mind. He had been briefed, and he knew the layout of the compound by heart. They would land in a blind spot, breach the service tunnels, and infiltrate the Duke's private quarters. Quick, clean, and quiet. The minutes ticked by, each second dragging longer than the last. John clenched and unclenched his fists, trying to calm the tension building in his muscles. He had been on edge ever since they boarded the ship, but now, as they closed in on their target, the full weight of the mission pressed down on him. Finally, the pilot's voice came through again, low and controlled. Approaching the landing zone. Touchdown in 60 seconds. Sarah stood by the hatch, her eyes scanning the team. Final checks, she ordered, her voice calm but firm. Marta, sitting beside Salah, worked quickly on her tablet, linking into the Duke's surveillance system. "I'll have their eyes down before we even touch the ground," she said, her fingers flying across the screen. No alarms, no alerts. Sun ran a quick check on his disarming tools, methodically adjusting the settings on the EMP charges he had prepared for any electronic traps. "I'll clear the path, no problem." Salah gave a sharp nod. "Comms will be down the moment we breach. No one will call for help." Mark grinned as he strapped his rifle to his chest. "You worry about the tech. I'll handle the fun part." John tightened the straps on his vest, his fingers trembling slightly as the seconds counted down. He wasn't nervous about the gear, everything was in place. What unnerved him was the thought of what would happen when they finally stepped foot on the Duke's territory. Assassination wasn't like any operation he had trained for. The target was more than just a name on a briefing document, it was a man. A man with power, influence, and soldiers at his disposal. "Touchdown," the pilot said, his voice steady. "You're clear to deploy." The hatch hissed open, and cold, thin air rushed into the cabin. John's breath caught in his throat as he stared out at the barren surface of the asteroid. The compound loomed in the distance, a massive industrial fortress surrounded by security turrets and patrolling guards. The dull glow of the facility's lights reflected off the jagged rock, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Sarah motioned for the team to move, her movements crisp and controlled. The team followed, stepping out into the darkness with silent precision. John fell in behind Sarah, his heart hammering in his chest as they advanced. Every step felt heavier, the tension building with each passing second. They moved quickly across the rocky terrain, staying low and out of sight as they approached the perimeter. Marta knelt beside a small access terminal, connecting her tablet to the compound surveillance system. Within seconds, the lights on the nearby cameras flickered and died, leaving the compound blind. "They're down," Marta whispered, her voice barely audible over the comms. "We're clear to proceed." Sarah motioned for Sun to move forward. The explosives expert moved with the calm confidence of someone who had disarmed 100 traps before. He approached the first checkpoint, a heavily guarded entrance with automated turrets, and knelt beside a hidden control panel. With a few precise movements, he disabled the sensors, ensuring they wouldn't trigger the alarm. "Path clear," Sun said quietly. "Let's move." John's breath quickened as they slipped past the checkpoint, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to spring into action. His mind raced, scanning for any sign of movement, any potential threat that could derail the mission. But so far, the compound was silent. Too silent. Mark, walking just ahead of John, kept his rifle raised, his eyes scanning the shadows. He was the team's muscle, always ready for a firefight. John could sense Mark's anticipation, the thrill of combat pulsing just beneath the surface. He knew Mark lived for this, but John's stomach churned at the thought of a firefight erupting in the tight confines of the compound. As they neared the main entrance, Salah split off from the group, heading toward the internal security hub. "I'll handle comms from here," he said. No alarms, no reinforcements. The rest of the team pressed forward, moving deeper into the heart of the compound. John's hands tightened around his weapon as they reached the entrance to the Duke's private quarters. This was it. Inside, Duke Darius Cool, the man responsible for the black market trade of Diridium, the man who had caused the death of the Prime Minister's son, waited, unaware of the death that was creeping toward him. Marta hacked into the door's control panel, her fingers moving with lightning speed as she bypassed the security protocols. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. Sarah gave a silent signal, and they entered, moving like shadows. John's pulse pounded in his ears as they advanced, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The corridor was lined with portraits of nobles and military leaders, a reminder of the Duke's wealth and power. But none of that mattered now. By the end of the night, Duke Darius would be dead. As they approached the final door, Sarah stopped, her voice a low whisper in John's ear. "This is it. Follow my lead." John nodded, swallowing hard. His throat was dry, his palms sweaty. This was the moment. Sarah pressed the control panel, and the door slid open, revealing a vast chamber dominated by a large, ornate desk. Seated at the desk, his back to them, was Duke Darius Cool. John's heart raced as they moved into the room, their footsteps silent on the cold, marble floor. The Duke was oblivious to their presence, his attention focused on the holographic display in front of him. Sarah raised her weapon, the silencer making a soft click as she aimed for the back of the Duke's head. Suddenly, a noise from the corridor, a faint metallic clink, made Sarah freeze. John's heart leapt into his throat. A moment later, the unmistakable sound of boots echoed from the hallway. "Mercenaries," Sarah hissed through clenched teeth. "They're coming." Before John could react, the door burst open, and a squad of heavily armed mercenaries stormed into the room, their weapons raised. "Take them out!" Sarah barked, diving for cover behind the desk. The room erupted into chaos. John's instincts kicked in as he darted behind a column, his weapon raised. Mark was already in the thick of it, firing controlled bursts at the incoming mercenaries. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, and the air filled with the deafening sound of gunfire. John peeked around the column, his pulse racing as he assessed the situation. The mercenaries were well-equipped, their armor thick and their movements coordinated. They weren't just hired muscle, they were professionals, and they were here to kill. Mark's voice came through the comms, sharp and urgent. "John, cover the left side." "I'll take the right." John moved quickly, his hand steady despite the chaos. He fired a burst of rounds at the mercenaries advancing on his side, the suppressor on his rifle muffling the shots. One mercenary went down, his body slumping against the wall, but two more took his place, their weapons trained on John. "Damn it," John muttered under his breath, ducking as a hail of bullets tore through the air above him. Sun was already working on the mercenaries' tactics, laying down suppressing fire with a cold efficiency. "We're pinned down," he said, his voice calm despite the situation. "John, can you get a better angle?" John's mind raced as he scanned the room. The mercenaries had the advantage of numbers, but they didn't know the layout as well as he did. There, a small alcove to his left, out of sight of the main entrance. If he could get there, he'd have a clean shot at the remaining mercenaries. "I'm moving," John said, keeping his voice low. He darted from his position, weaving between cover as gunfire exploded around him. His enhanced reflexes kicked in, allowing him to move faster than the mercenaries could track. Within seconds, he reached the alcove, his heart pounding as he aimed his rifle. "Go for the leader," Sarah's voice crackled in his ear. "Take him out, and the rest will scatter." John's eyes locked onto the mercenary captain, a tall, armored figure standing near the back of the group, barking orders to his squad. Without hesitating, John squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. The mercenary captain crumpled to the ground, a single bullet piercing his helmet. Chaos erupted among the remaining mercenaries. Confusion spread through their ranks as they lost cohesion, their movements becoming frantic. Mark seized the opportunity, firing in controlled bursts as he picked off the scattered mercenaries one by one. Sun moved in tandem, methodically eliminating the remaining threats. Within minutes, the firefight was over. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the soft hum of the Duke's holographic display still flickering at his desk. Sarah stood from behind the desk, her expression hard as she looked down at the Duke, who remained oblivious to the violence that had just taken place. "Let's finish this," she said coldly, raising her weapon once more. John stepped beside her, his breath steady now as he aimed his rifle. "For the Emperor," Sarah whispered. A single shot rang out, and Duke Darius Cool slumped forward in his chair, dead. The room fell into a heavy silence as the final shot echoed through the air. Duke Darius Cool's body slumped forward over his desk, the holographic display flickering as his lifeless head knocked against it. The mission was over, the target eliminated. John's breath came in slow, controlled gasps, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His hands tightened around his rifle as he scanned the room, the eerie quiet that followed the firefight settling over them like a thick blanket. The mercenaries lay scattered across the floor, their bodies still, the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood lingering in the air. Sarah lowered her weapon, her expression unreadable as she approached the Duke's lifeless form. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had done this too many times before. Without a word, she checked his pulse, confirming what they already knew: Duke Darius Cool was dead. For the Emperor, she muttered under her breath, the weight of the words lingering in the silence. John stepped forward, his heart still racing, though the immediate danger had passed. His eyes flicked over the scene, his mind struggling to catch up to what had just happened. The Duke, a man of immense power and influence, was now nothing more than a lifeless body slumped over a desk. It felt surreal, and yet the mission had been executed perfectly. They had infiltrated, taken out the target, and survived the firefight with the mercenaries. Sarah turned to the rest of the team, her face hard and focused. "We're not done yet. Marta, grab any data you can from the Duke's systems. We need evidence of his dealings, proof for the Emperor that we've wiped out the black market operation." Marta was already moving, her fingers flying across her tablet as she tapped into the Duke's private terminal. The screens lit up with lines of code and encrypted files. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady. "Give me a minute to pull everything." Sun knelt beside one of the fallen mercenaries, methodically checking the bodies for any hidden threats. "No more surprises," he confirmed. "But we need to move fast. Once the Duke's people realize what's happened, it won't take long for them to mobilize." Mark, his usual grin still absent, wiped sweat from his brow as he slung his rifle back over his shoulder. "Can't say I'll miss this guy, but it feels good to have that part done. Now, let's get out before more companies show up." John remained silent, his mind replaying the event of the last few minutes. The firefight had been intense, the mercenaries highly trained, but the team had worked like a well-oiled machine. Each member had played their part perfectly, and John felt a surge of pride in how he had handled himself. But there was something about watching a man die, seeing the life leave his body, that made John uneasy. This was the work of the shadows of the night, the Emperor's hidden hand, and now John was truly part of it. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "John, stay sharp. We're not out of this yet." John blinked and nodded, pulling his focus back to the present. "Right. What's next?" "We extract the data, and then we exfiltrate," Sarah said, her tone clipped. "Our ride is waiting, but we need to get back to the landing zone before they detect us." Marta's fingers continued to fly across the terminal, decrypting files faster than John could follow. "Almost there." "Got it," she said finally, a look of satisfaction crossing her face. "We've got records of every illegal Doridium deal he's made in the last 2 years. This is more than enough to destroy his network." "Good," Sarah said, her eyes cold. "Wipe the rest of the system. Leave no trace." Marta nodded, her hands moving swiftly to erase the Duke's files from the terminal. Within seconds, the screens went dark, leaving only the faint glow of emergency lighting illuminating the room. Sarah motioned to the door. "We're moving out. Sun, take point. Mark, cover the rear." Sun was already at the door, scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. "Clear," he said quietly. The team moved swiftly through the compound, their steps silent and calculated. John followed close behind Sarah, his senses heightened, every creak of the floor or flicker of a shadow putting him on edge. The firefight had been contained, but they were still deep in enemy territory. If the Duke's forces realized what had happened before they escaped, the mission could turn from a success to a disaster in seconds. As they moved through the dimly lit corridors, the enormity of the mission sank in. They had just assassinated one of the most powerful men in the Shillong sector, a noble with enough wealth and connections to challenge the Emperor. And yet, despite the power and influence Duke Darius had wielded, his life had ended in silence, a single shot to the back of the head in the shadows of his own fortress. John couldn't shake the surreal feeling that hung over him. They reached the outer edge of the compound, where Sun had disabled the perimeter defenses earlier. The path to the landing zone was clear, but John knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Marta's voice came through the comms, her tone tense. "We've got a problem. I'm picking up movement, multiple heat signatures converging on our position. Looks like a patrol just changed course." Sarah's expression didn't waver. "How far?" 500 meters out. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they're on us," Marta replied. "Move," Sarah ordered, her voice firm but calm. "We can't let them cut us off. Son, keep an eye out for traps. Mark, be ready for anything." They sprinted through the compound's outer corridors, moving with practiced efficiency. John could feel the tension building in his chest as the seconds ticked by. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every distant sound a potential ambush. He gripped his rifle tighter, his eyes scanning the path ahead. "Trap!" Sun's voice cut through the silence as he stopped abruptly, raising his hand. John's heart skipped a beat as he watched Sun crouch down beside an innocuous-looking section of the floor. "Pressure plate," Sun muttered, carefully disarming the explosive device. "They rigged this place tighter than we thought." John's pulse quickened. Every second they spent disarming traps was a second closer to the enemy catching up. Almost there, Marta's voice crackled through the comms. "I've got a visual on the patrol. They're closing in fast." "Son!" Sarah's voice had an edge to it, the urgency clear. "Done," Sun said, stepping back from the now disarmed trap. "Go." They bolted down the corridor, the dim emergency lights casting long, ominous shadows as they raced toward the exit. John's lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep up, his mind locked in survival mode. They had made it this far, but it wasn't over yet. They reached the outer airlock, the final barrier between them and the landing zone. Sarah motioned for John to help her secure the door as the others moved into position. Marta's voice was tense over the comms. "The patrol's almost on us. We've got maybe 30 seconds. Get ready," Mark muttered, his rifle trained on the corridor behind them. The door slid open, revealing the dark, desolate landscape of the asteroid beyond. The landing zone was just ahead, the stealth ship waiting for them like a beacon of salvation. "Move! Move!" Sarah ordered, waving them through. John sprinted through the airlock, the cold, thin air of the asteroid biting at his face as they raced toward the ship. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, heavy boots pounding against the metal floor as the patrol closed in. "Contacts!" Salah shouted, turning and firing a burst of rounds into the corridor. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them as the patrol engaged. John dropped into a crouch behind a jagged rock, his rifle at the ready as he returned fire. The mercenaries were well armed and disciplined, their shots precise as they advanced. "Keep them off us!" Sarah barked, her voice sharp as she moved toward the ship. "We're almost out of here." Mark, clearly in his element, fired controlled bursts, keeping the mercenaries at bay. Sun laid down suppressing fire with deadly precision, while Salah provided cover as the team began to fall back toward the ship. John's heart pounded in his chest as he fired at the advancing patrol. His shots were measured, his aim steady, but the mercenaries weren't letting up. He could see the determination in their movements, they knew they were dealing with professionals, and they weren't going to give up easily. "John, fall back!" Sarah's voice snapped him out of his focus. He glanced over his shoulder, seeing the ship's hatch open, Marta already inside working to activate the ship's systems. They needed to move, and fast. John fired one last burst of rounds, then sprinted toward the ship, his legs burning as he pushed himself to keep up with the team. Mark and Sun were right behind him, their rifles still firing as they ran. The moment they reached the ship, Salah slammed his hand on the control panel, sealing the hatch behind them. The sound of gunfire was cut off, replaced by the low hum of the ship's engines coming to life. "Strap in!" Sarah ordered, moving to the cockpit as the ship lifted off the ground. John collapsed into a seat, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His mind was still racing, the adrenaline from the firefight coursing through him. They had made it. The mission was complete, and they were alive. The ship shuddered as it broke free of the asteroid's gravity, the view of the compound fading into the distance. John stared out the window, watching as the Shillong sector disappeared behind them, swallowed by the endless black void of space. It was over. Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. Mission accomplished. Duke Darius is dead. We're heading home. John let out a long breath, his body finally relaxing as the reality of their success sank in. They had done it. His first mission with the Shadows, and they had succeeded.